Hey, what's up, guys? We have Jordan Miller here. He is the founder of Satori. So how's it going, Jordan? How you doing today?
It's going good. How are you?
Good. So I guess just first, let's just go over your company. What does your company do exactly?
Well, it's a nonprofit organization and it's a community project. So I started it, I created a lot of the code for it, um, kind of got it started, but it's mostly a community project. So what it is a network of computers. This is the actual tech of it. It's a network of computers that predict the future. So that's what Satori is. They work together to predict the future. They're all watching something out there in the real world, and they try to correlate that, what they're watching with what the other computers are watching on the network. And then they try to work with each other to figure out what's going to happen in the future. So that's all it is, mostly.
Wow, and that's probably one of the most important things is kind of like predicting the future, right? I mean, in terms of like making money, if you could predict the future, you pretty much nailed it.
In terms of everything, really. I mean, because the, have you heard of, what is the name of that? Um, Maxwell's Demon?
No.
This is a thought experiment.
I think I've heard of Laplace's demon.
It might be the same thing. I don't know.
Okay,
I'm
okay,
not a
okay.
math guy, so.
No. Yeah, I was just wondering if it was the same thing or not.
um, but Maxwell came up with this thought experiment and said, when they were trying to figure out like what entropy is, and he said, well, if a little demon was in a system and had perfect knowledge of the future of that system, then he could put the system in any state that he wanted with like zero effort or with like no mistakes. Um, and so, for making money, yeah, if you can see the future, you can make money as fast as you possibly could. But also for avoiding disaster, um, you know, uh, problems like the housing crisis that we experienced or the pandemic, if you could see all the moving parts, then you could make the best outcome for everybody. So that's why it's a kind of a made as a community project and kind of a public good as much as possible.
Okay, so how do you want to use it for like the public good?
The idea behind that is what we do is we start watching everything in the world at the largest scales. Like you can see the world as a series of data streams. And so you start watching the data streams that kind of influence everything the most. And one of those, like a great example off the top of my head is like inflation. Inflation affects all prices and all economic decisions that anybody ever makes, in some way or another. So if you can predict that, then you have a pretty good handle on everything economic that you wouldn't have otherwise. So um, in order to kind of do this for the world, we try to find all the data streams that are the most high level, most effective on everything else.
Okay, so let's just we can circle back to like your company, but let's just start off with AI. In terms of AI, how close do you think we are to doing, or I guess how close are you, or how close is AI in general to actually predicting the future and even potentially predicting like the past too to see like exactly where we came from and all that?
The AI has not been able to do forecasting very well. Like we've had algorithms that do forecasting, but like the deep neural nets and like the stuff that can do language right now, all those kind of latest and greatest stuff hasn't been able to do forecasting well. And I think they are going to be able to do forecasting really soon, very well. And so we're trying to experiment with that, try to gain that expertise and develop that ability. Forecasting is difficult because things have feedback mechanisms. Like if you're an academic and you figure out, okay, this asset, the price of this asset has been historically correlated very well with the price of this other asset or with, something else. And then you publish that data. Well, immediately people start trading on that data and the correlation goes away. So because there's this feedback mechanism with the environment, it's very hard to predict the future. That's why they haven't been able to do it yet, the AIs. However, they're getting better and better. And in order to map all those relationships, I believe, I mean, this is kind of the fundamental premise of Satori, that you should map that relationship on a network of nodes that can, dynamically change how they relate to one another in order to match those feedback mechanisms, and update in real time. So I don't know. Does that kind of answer your question? That we're getting close.
Yeah. And it does have to do with kind of like chaos theory, like
Yeah,
where, yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
So I kind of want, I mean, I would want to go into like how, yeah, I would want to go into like how the AI does it, but I feel like that's a little bit probably too hard to understand. So in terms, yeah, so in terms of what about the past? I mean, like, are we close to figuring out the past too, as long with the future? I mean, what I guess what's easier, the past or the future? You know what I mean?
We
And by the
we
past, I mean
record the
like,
past.
millions of years ago,
Right. Yes.
or
We
even thousands.
pass what we can record or what we have evidence of. We just have to infer. And that's also true of the future. So, in some ways, the distant past is as ambiguous as the distant future. Um, and so, if we're good at predicting the future, we would also be good at putting the past together, I think. So, goes
Okay,
both
but
ways.
I know that yeah, like they say like 14 is it 14 billion years ago is when the Big Bang happened, right?
Yeah,
Something
that's the
like that.
idea. Yeah.
Yeah, and then it's like up until now they kind of have an idea for what happened, but it's like I kind of obviously I don't really know, but I kind of question how much we really actually know what happened.
Yeah.
Three
Yeah.
even 3 million years ago or something. A lot of it, I mean, not only has to do with obviously AI, but with also like um archaeological stuff and all that. But
Yeah. You always want to go with the best data available. And so the scientific community kind of tries to shepherd the best data available and make sure that we have good working models. But they're not always right. And so, it's not at the end of the day, you just don't know a lot of things that you might think you do know.
yeah. So in terms of everything that's going on now with AI, like how soon do you think like the singularity will happen?
Singularity is an interesting, well, it depends on how you define it. Because you could define it in many different ways. The way I kind of define it, it's quite a ways out, past my lifetime. Um, in theory, I suppose it doesn't have to be past my lifetime, but I think the singularity is quite a ways out. So Ray Kurzweil and a lot of people might define the singularity as when a computing power gets to be like beyond our comprehension or something like that, right? And I think that's a fine definition. That could be 2045, whatever. When I think of the singularity, I kind of define it more in terms of how we're going to connect with each other and connect to each other. So right now, and the long march of like technological and communicative history, technology, um, has been greater and greater bandwidth. We've been trying to make better and better connections with each other and with the machines now. But mainly with each other, right? So we used to have to use word of mouth, and that's how we could communicate with each other, and that was it, right? And then we invented writing. That was pretty big deal. And then we invented, like I don't know, eventually we invented like the printing press, but you could like send messages on horses, couriers, snail mail, whatever. Eventually we got to the point where we're like, okay, now we can travel faster. We have trains. Now we have the telegraph. Then instead of just like little beeps across the country, let's make it into phone calls, let's make it into, television and the internet. So we've been just trying to increase the bandwidth between all of us as fast as we possibly could. And so if we take that out to its ultimate end, I think we get to the point where we say human brains can communicate with other human brains at the speed at which the two hemispheres of our brains communicate with each other. And once we get to that level, that seems like a good definition of the singularity to me. And that's probably very far away. 100,000, I don't know. It's many, many years away. So I don't worry about it too much.
Yeah. In terms of like an evolutionary perspective, do you feel like there's a reason why we're doing that? Like there's like a certain we're like kind of heading in an evolutionary direction for some reason. Like some people think like it's to like create the next kind of creature, which would be AI or whatever, you know what I mean? But in
Yeah,
terms of just what you said, like being able to communicate with each other, like is there some reason why we're doing that, you think? Or is it just kind of like happening? You know what I mean? Like
yeah. Like, why are we tending towards that? I don't know exactly, but it seems like that's the algorithm of intelligence anyway. Because, when an organism starts to evolve, their skin, the neurons in their skin, or, they might not even have eyes, uh, these external neurons, they kind of take a while to develop, they take generations to develop in such a way that they manage the data well before that data hits the brain, because data comes into our eyes, into our hands, into our ears, and it gets managed, it gets mutated right there before it actually reaches the brain. So it's like the evolutionary process um, kind of does this thing that we've been seeing in technology of increasing the bandwidth where it needs to be increased. A lot of data flows through our hands because we use our hands all the time. So we have a lot of bandwidth between our brain and our hands. And so it seems like that is kind of the natural path of evolution, both and if you define like intelligence as an extension of evolution or evolution as an expression of intelligence, it seems like that's just the natural order.
yeah. And do you feel like this could also be true with other animals? Like I've always kind of wondered, like, are other animals getting smarter and eventually going to be able to like communicate like us? You know what I mean? Or do you think it's kind of like always going to stay the same between, or I guess with animals? I know humans might eventually kind of morph into technology, but do you think animals are kind of also getting smarter?
They probably are, but it's probably on time scales that we don't notice. It kind of feels um, like it's a bubbling brew, right? Like they increase and might decrease in intelligence, but every once in a while something pops off and becomes really intelligent.
Yeah. And so you mentioned Ray Kurzweil. So he thinks that the singularity is going to happen in, I think it was in 2035 or 2045. And his definition would be, I think the main thing would be kind of like for him might be immortality, right?
Oh,
Um, and then on top of that, just kind of like everything getting so kind of like crazy that like we don't know what's going to happen, you know?
yeah.
So in terms of the immortality thing, do you think he's anywhere close to being correct that we might be able to live forever within the next? 20 years or so.
It's possible, but if it happens, here's what I think. It would be hard to make that happen. You might be able to figure it out and say, well, okay, we figured out how to make the hardware of our bodies live twice as long, right? Like, I don't know. Like, and that buys us a little more time to figure out how to put our conscious experience into a machine, which basically could guarantee living forever, right? So, but I think that's the only real option. We're too complicated to turn into like jellyfish where we can just kind of rejuvenate forever. I think we're just too complicated for that unless I just don't understand the biology, which is very, very possible. But it seems like that would be hard to do. I mean, because we have so many different organs and they all work differently and they all age differently and they all could have different kind of problems. It seems hard. Say, yeah. But um, but then you say, well, okay, well, what about downloading my consciousness into a machine? And that seems like a very difficult thing to do because if you disconnect, if you say, well, my awareness is this model in my head, this pattern of neurons or something like that. Then if you just copy and paste that into a machine, you say, I have the hardware, it can simulate it, it's good enough, I've got plenty of whatever, bandwidth, we're good to go. If you do that, then you have a copy of you in the machine. You don't have you in the machine, right? You're still running on your brain. So in order to actually move into the machine, it has to be something you grow into. And I don't know how long that would take. It'd have to be something that you, I don't know, you connect up to the machine with some computer brain interface, and not only do your thoughts transmit into the machine, but it responds back to you according to that and modifies your thinking. And so it doesn't seem very, very simple to me to just transfer. It doesn't seem like that's maybe not possible or whatever. But if you morph into the machine, like we all grow, right? I mean, we were all babies with a very different brain structure and a very different, smaller brain and everything. And we identify ourselves as the same individual as back then. And so it's probably possible to, over time, morph into it, but it's probably not possible to just transfer consciousness into a machine directly, instantly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know really how we would like morph into it unless you kind of mean like you're literally kind of like you become like a hybrid or whatever. What's that called? Like where like you become the
Cyborg.
yeah, cyborg. So is that kind of like what you're talking about? Where like you would almost like slowly turn into kind of like a cyborg and then
Well, you
eventually
could do
just
it
fully
like a
machine.
thought experiment and just assume like, okay, we've got way advanced technology. Our nanotechnology is amazing. And so what we can do is we can have a little nanobot enter our brain and it will, find a neuron, just one neuron, and it will assume its position. It will look at everything that it's connected to and it will watch how it runs. And then after it's been watching for a little while, it kills the neuron and takes its place. And it says, I'm going to transfer the signals that this neuron would have transferred. And you do that with one neuron in your brain, and then you don't really experience any different reality in real life at all, right? Everything's the same. The data that's transferring from one side of the brain is successfully getting to the other side, and there's no problem, right? Everything's good. Well, then you do it with another neuron and another and another and another, and over, your experience is exactly the same, and yet in a year, now you have a cyborg, computerized, mechanized brain, right? And so you can just run that like little thought experiment and see that we can morph into a different medium, you know, but it takes time, so that there's no broken experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it wouldn't necessarily be like you just like transfer the brain as if it's a computer into a computer. It would almost be like we just slowly become that, and then we would stay, ideally kind of stay in the same form we are, besides having the like um computer or whatever you call it, like in us almost, right?
Right. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, it's all speculation and just fun. I mean, who knows what's going on? So,
Yeah. And a lot of people look at it like, even I, kind of as almost like a Black Mirror episode where it could get kind of like scary or sketchy. And it doesn't, like, I just saw this movie, The Substance. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's
no.
basically it's like Demi Moore and another female actress, but she's getting older and she wants to become younger. So she takes this substance that makes her younger, but like it literally splits her into two people.
Oh,
And then it like just goes, it goes real haywire. It's the type of thing where it's like, I think that might be, like we were saying before, predicting the future is one thing that everybody wants, but then the second thing would probably be like, immortality or youthfulness or whatever. But then when you start messing with stuff like that, it can get pretty scary,
yeah.
and you don't really know what the effects are going to be. What about like cloning? I mean, it seems like we've heard about cloning forever. I mean, is there any? It just sounds like so crazy, but I mean, supposedly they've cloned animals, right? So it's like, is there any potential to like for the future to like clone a human? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, all this kind of sci-fi ideas, then you could say, well, okay, I can live a lot longer now because I just cloned the organs that are failing and just get brand new ones like computer parts. It's possible. Could happen.
I mean, do you think as of right? Because I mean, they've said they've cloned animals, right? So like, is it possible like now to clone a human? Do you know? Like,
Oh, I'm sure it's possible.
have they just made it like illegal or something, or like why aren't they doing it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, it's probably not possible in the way that it looks in the movies, like you can clone and they have had situations where they say the clones of animals aren't exactly right. Like they age faster or something like that. Like like something's there. I don't know. I don't know the cloning sciences, but if you
Yeah,
can
yeah. This
clone
is
an animal, then you can definitely clone a human. I mean, we're just animals. So
yeah. I would just imagine the only reason why we're not doing it is because it's just illegal, and it's just too like it's too messy, like it's just too weird, and we don't want to like deal with the implications, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of what um like Chat GPT, OpenAI, Facebook, Google, um who are the other big, I guess it would be Meta. Um how do you think everything's going with, I guess the main thing right now would be like the LLMs, Chat GPT, and then also the video generation, and also the I'm doing like a lot of like the picture AI, pictures and then videos and all that kind of stuff. It's
Yeah.
getting pretty crazy. So in terms of what do you think about OpenAI, Sam Altman, I guess Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk has the XAI. How do you how do you think they're all doing? Like, are you pretty impressed with the LLMs and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. LLMs are cool. Like they've been in the making for a long time. I remember saying to a friend who was only like, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, maybe something like that. Probably maybe six. And I was talking to him like, as soon as they figure out language with machines, really they've mastered language, the whole world is going to be completely different. It's just going to be wild. And I think we're watching that happen in real time. And of course, there's hype cycles and people, think it's going to be more amazing, and then they see limitations and it goes back and forth. So I think that's kind of what you're asking, is kind of the hype cycle, or like, how important is this technology really? Is it a gimmick, or is it like really fundamentally important? I think it's fundamentally amazing, because you can model everything as a language, everything is a language. And so these um, these LLMs that actually model linguistic language are interesting, very powerful, but also the stuff you're doing with the images and all that, that's a language too, right? It's found the language that makes sense within the image space of all the images we take and create, and art and everything. So it's exploring that state space, and if it can map it, that's really impressive. It basically can map every kind of uh, what's it called? Spatial pattern. So there's two kinds of patterns, from my perspective at least. There's spatial patterns and there's temporal patterns. And spatial patterns, well, temporal patterns are just spatial patterns um, over time. So they're just multiple, but they have feedback loops and mechanisms. So they have implied patterns that you have to discern and manage and map. Anyway, so with the LLMs and the current technology, they're massive, massive models. They're just really big, right? So they're really big models, and they can make a map of anything, or the bigger they get, the more that becomes true. So any spatial pattern, any static state space, they can map it out. They can say, well, this word is related to these other words in all of these different contexts. I've got it mapped out. And it's like a static structure. It's like a map. But once you add a time element to it, it starts to have feedback mechanisms on itself. And it seems like that's a more difficult thing. It's like the next layer of difficulty in mapping. It's hard to make a map of that. And this is why the LLMs, they don't do the markets yet. They don't predict the markets yet. They don't do forecasting yet, because they're just a static model. And if you want to map a huge space like the English language, go for it. You gather the data and you make the map, and it takes you 6 months or a year or whatever. And then you wait, because language evolves over time, right? It's not static. We pretend like it's static, but new words are being invented, and the way people talk is different year to year. And so languages evolve. They exist in time, just like everything else. And so in a few years, or eventually, even if you didn't want to build a better model, you have to rebuild the model in order to stay up to date. So now, if the time element becomes really important, like things are evolving every day, what if that was true of language? And you said, well, we're gonna model language, but in 3 months it's like a completely different language. Well, it takes 6 months to train the model, so it's going to be useless by the time it comes out, right? And so that's the problem that we have with forecasting the future, is that everything is evolving all the time really fast, and you have to build a model of that evolution. And that's I don't know if that's a static state space model. It's changing, and that's where we get the chaos theory. So now the question becomes, if you have a network of models that are more quickly updating, they don't take 6 months to train, they take 6 minutes to train. So they're more quickly updating, and they can kind of make their model of the way the world is and make models about how it's changed over time and how it's going to change in the future, and track the evolution, then that's kind of the vision behind Satori. We said, well, we're going to need a network because we can't just do this with one model. We have to build a network of communicating models that can map those feedback mechanisms and start to get a handle on how things evolve with each other. So I don't know if that answers your question. Does that help?
No, it did, yeah, for sure. In terms of real quick, in terms of you predicting the future and mapping things out, like, do you literally have like cameras? Like, do you literally have to kind of have like cameras watching things to like predict what's going to happen, or like, you know what I mean? How are you doing that?
Yeah, I would think of it more like, I would think of the human world, our civilization and, the earth as a human body. And so what we've built with the internet so far is basically a superhighway of information. So what we built is a nervous system on the planet. And what we have is like, there's sensors all over the world, right? So there's cameras, like you mentioned. We measure stock prices every minute, that kind of thing. Um, we measure things. We measure stuff like where's the population going, you know, everything that we measure on the planet is, kind of becomes available on the internet at some point. And so that's like a nervous system in the body. We have all these we have all these neurons reaching out into our fingers and our eyes and our ears. And so they have different kinds of sensors. But yeah, that's kind of what the internet is, in my opinion, is you can transfer data, all over the place. And so you can measure the real world, air temperatures, sea temperatures. We can put sensors that measure some kind of numeric metric or information of some kind all over the world. And um, so what we don't have is we don't have like a central nervous system. We have like the basics of the central nervous system. We have a market, we have markets, and I would say that's probably analogous to like the lower parts of the brain, the reptilian brain kind of thing. It's very needed, very necessary, and can do a lot of intelligent things. But we don't have like the top layer of humanity's or society's intelligence. We don't have the top layers of the brain where things are actually watching to see what the future is going to be and then correlating that with each other. That's kind of what the neocortex does. So, so anyway, yeah, the system needs to watch just the whole world through whatever sensors are available. And that's just basically any data stream that changes over time.
And so that's it's like more kind of like mapping the internet as opposed to the real world, but the internet really kind of does map the real world because you have so many videos on YouTube and everywhere else that you can kind of see what's going on
Yeah.
out there, right? Yeah. In terms of the next thing beyond LLMs, I mean, my thing with LLMs right now is it's like obviously like they're impressive, and I'm actually using them for like YouTube videos and stuff, but they do get information wrong a lot, and it's like people say, well, they're new and it's expected or whatever, but it's like that could be pretty bad. I mean, it's like I would probably I literally just did a video and it was pretty simple. It was on like the DJI Neo, which is like a drone. I don't know if you know about
Mm-mm.
drones at all, but it's like this mini drone. And I was like, just the specs, like just give me the specs on it. And he gave me the specs, but it was like pretty off. And it was like, this
Yeah.
could be pretty bad in terms of misinformation. Um, which we're already having, but like now, like people saying, "Oh, well, the AI told me that this was true," and it's just clearly wrong. But And if you want, you can give your thoughts on that. But then also, what do you think the next thing will be? I mean, I guess the main thing right now would be the LLMs and like right in terms of AI, and then AI. It's I think it's I think I definitely think it's interesting that like they I think people thought that it was when we came out with AI or robots or whatever, it was going to be more like, in a warehouse, like lifting stuff, but it's like really kind of taking over the whole um, art scene
Yeah.
more and like writing scene more. So, what do you think the next step is in terms of the AI evolution, the next big leap?
I kind of think it has to do with like the big leap. I feel like it has to do with time. We have to get a handle on time, and it's hard to do. And I'm sure like people are thinking about this at Meta and everywhere else, but there's so much money to be made in just mapping spatial dimensions right now that it does seem like that's just what they're focused on, and they're waiting for the academics to figure out time, and then they'll jump into that eventually. So, I mean, that's kind of just how it feels to me. I don't know. I'm just guessing essentially. But at some point we've got to manage time, and that will be a big leap. I don't know if it's the next one, but yeah.
Do you feel like part of the reason why it can't manage time is because, um, like some people say, like there is no, is it that there is no time, or is it that it's like we've kind of made up time? Like, what do you like? Do you believe, do you believe like in time, or do you think? Because I mean, don't they say like the actual arrow of time or whatever would be like entropy or whatever, which is like entropy. Is it depleting or
Right,
so?
right.
So in
Yeah.
terms, do you think part of the reason why the computer doesn't really understand time is because it really is kind of just made up by humans, or do you actually feel like there is like a logical kind of time? Um, you know what I mean?
I do on a metaphysical layer. I mean, people talk about this and they're like, time's a construct. I don't know. I don't know. But here's what I do know. I mean, think about the brain. And I like to think about the brain of an infant. It knows nothing, right? It knows absolutely nothing. And so if you've seen infants, they kind of flail their arms about, they don't really have a lot of control over anything. Um, Everything's just kind of chaotic and random, right? And so the brain of that baby is trying to figure out what the world is. And the only thing that it has as a hook is the idea that there's going to be a next moment. And when that next moment comes, I might have this experience, like I might have an experience, some stimulation on my hand, or, a bright light or something, right? It could be anything, right? I have all these sensors throughout my whole body. I don't even have a concept of my body really yet, but I have a bunch of data flowing into my brain. And I don't know what that data is going to be. But if I did, if I could just anticipate it a little bit, maybe I could make it into something that I like. Maybe I could gain some control. You know, if I could anticipate that if I move this muscle, I'm going to feel stimulation on my hand because it moves my hand or something like that. If it can get that, then it can start to manage the world that it lives in, right? So then it can get control of its body, then it can get control of its environment, and it can kind of experience a good experience rather than a chaotic one or a painful one. And so it kind of seems to me like for that reason, we should just assume, for all practical purposes, that time is a fundamental aspect of being. And if we want to get into the metaphysics of what that might mean, or whether or not that's true. I think metaphysics is kind of a little bit beyond the practical in many cases. So we might say, well, let's not conceptualize it that way when we're thinking of metaphysics. But I think for all practical purposes, we should think of it that way, that it's fundamental and that we can model it and we can get a handle on it and we can survive by knowing the future. That's kind of the goal.
Yeah. So just to finish up on AI real quick, and then we'll go into more of consciousness, which is what I wanted to. So as far as the AI, you said the next thing would be trying to get a handle on time, but what do you think in terms of actual AI processing or doing? What do you think the next thing will be once it gets a grasp on time? Like if the thing before was LLMs, then what do you think the next thing will be?
Um, Control. So if you have a, if you have an, if you have a, if you can predict the future, then you can control the future.
And you think we'll eventually get to that place?
I do. Yeah,
And by control, you mean like kind of like almost like controlling the weather, controlling
everything.
everything, like the controlling death, controlling just everything.
Yeah, yeah. And so, yeah. At first,
And
we'll
so
get it
then,
on
and
a
you think
large
that's
scale.
that's the next step?
No, well, these things happen. You know how like a ruler has kind of like a few little ticks and a big one, and then a really big one because it's like 1 inch, right? And then I go down and up. So I kind of feel like if you want to look at the broadest scale, the inches, then uh, we could call that like the next big one, maybe. I don't know. It's like a big one, but I think there's going to be lots of little impressive things that are going to happen before that really comes to fruition. So if you're talking about next, like in the next couple of years or the next year,
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know how things are going to evolve immediately. But at the largest scale, I think the next biggest thing anybody could foresee would be the modeling of time.
Okay. And then in terms of AGI, do you think that could potentially be the next thing? Do you think that could be soon?
Could be. It could be sooner. It could be sooner than time. I don't know. I don't know. Because it also depends on how you define AGI, just like the singularity. If you define, we almost have AGI right now by some definitions. We have a reasoning, linguistic, as far as we have a linguistic model that can imitate reasoning by exploring or expressing the reasoning inherent in our language. So that's really close to AGI. You talked about how these LLMs, they don't always tell the truth, and they don't know the truth, and so we treat them as these, you know, arbiters of truth because they've read everything, but it doesn't mean that they are the truth. In fact, what they're actually approximating seems to be, what should I say that the, user wants to hear? That's not the truth, right? In some cases, it's really close to the truth, like if I'm coding or I want some specs, then it's just a technical detail. Yeah, just give me the truth. But if I have a political agenda or, some kind of, if there's any kind of conflict around something that it could say, it optimizes for not offending. So that's that could be far away from the truth. So they don't optimize for the truth. And I think that's important for people to understand. Um, and even when they try to optimize for the truth, if they get it wrong, they don't know that they got it wrong. And so they'll just say something wrong. And we saw this in split brain problems too. Like they cut brains in half and said, we're going to show you some information to the side of your brain that can't talk, because speaking is lateralized to one hemisphere. So we'll send information to the side of your brain that can't talk. But because that information now can't get to the other side of your brain, we're now going to ask you verbal questions about the thing, right? Or about your behavior, or about something that there's no way you could know anything about. But because, your body took action or something, you have to explain it. And you should have the answer. Your brain knows that it should have the answer, but it doesn't. And so they would ask questions to these people, and their brains, the hemisphere that could talk but didn't actually know what it was talking about, but thought it should, would just make stuff up. And it was completely sure of itself that it had the right answer. And so the LLMs are not that far from our language centers. They're very similar as far as like that aspect of them. They'll just make stuff up just like we will. Just like we will.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that I've noticed is that it does just that, which is it tells like half lies, where it's almost like just like a human would, where it's like you ask a person a question and they're like, part of it is true, and then the rest of it isn't. Like if I ask about like a movie or something that's coming out, it'll like replace, actors or whatever. Like, but it's like it kind of gets it right. Like it could potentially be right, and I don't know if it's getting the information from bad sources or if it's just literally making it up. And I mean, the way that I kind of look at LLM, I'm like very fascinated with AI and what they're doing, and I think it's exceptional. But at the same time, I'm almost kind of like, is this really just kind of like regurgitating what it says on the internet and just rephrasing it? I don't really know. But I've also heard that like something about, and I haven't really understood this, but I'm sure you do, where it like all it does is it like predicts the next word, and I don't
Yeah.
really know what that means by predicting. Like when it's giving you an answer, it's literally just predicting the next word.
Yes. Yes, literally. It's literally just predicting. It's saying, okay, what are the words that have come before? Okay, in this context, given that we're talking about computers, and I just, and maybe itself, it just said the word Apple. And so it says, okay, given this context, I just said the word Apple. I'm going to say more things, related to computers rather than related to fruit. And so that's just how it works. It just knows the context given uh, the context that it has produced.
That seems weird. So it's really not doing what I'm saying, which would be just transcribing or rewording something that it, like another maybe one website says this. It's not necessarily just rewording that. It's actually spitting stuff out on its own, word by word, from like its own context. Or
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's read all the stuff. So it's been trained on all the information. So the information has gotten into its model. It doesn't mean that it's been trained well, right? But it's had training on all this data. So then it says, okay, I was trained on a lot of information of people talking about fruit, and they used the word apple a lot. But I also was trained on a lot of people, using the word apple when they were talking about computers, and they didn't seem to be talking about fruit at all. And so it builds this map where this same word is in multiple locations in different contexts. And then it's basically traveling through that map when it produces its output. And so it doesn't grab, fruit related concepts when it's over here in the context of computers.
So I mean, could they just build a model that does what I'm saying, which is basically like give me the information on this, and it just basically, but it's not like illegal to like reword something someone else wrote. So could it just potentially just do that, where it's like literally just give me like this essay and just and reword it? You know what I mean? It seems like that would almost be like easier than doing what it's doing.
Yeah, but I think what they're trying to optimize for is generality. So like making sure that it's as generally intelligent as possible. Um, because if you just make a like a you could make like a computer bot and some specific models that do summarization. You could have done that a long time ago, but um, but yeah, the newer stuff is just trying to be as general as possible, I think.
Hey, we cut it out.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry about that. I think it may have been me. I've been having an issue with. We got like a new Wi-Fi thing, so I've been having an issue with that. So it was probably my end. So what were you saying? Sorry about that.
I was just saying they're trying to make these models as general as possible.
Yeah, they
So
don't want
that's
they don't want it to be like a regurgitating machine. They want it to actually think on its own, right? Yeah,
as much as possible. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so in terms of um, yeah, I want to get to the consciousness thing, but real quick, I want to ask you this question before we go into that. In terms of what everyone's doing, in terms of the AI, who do you think is doing it the best? It's kind of like a two-part question. And then also, what do you think of like Sam Altman and all those guys, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg? You hear a lot of like kind of negative things about mostly a lot of it's Sam Altman, but obviously Elon Musk gets some obvious shit too. And then Mark Zuckerberg with like the stealing data thing or whatever. So who do you think is which company do you think is doing it the best? And then also, do you think they have good intentions
Hmm.
with what they're doing, or do you think they're a lot of the like the safety concerns or whatever? Do you think they're kind of like going too far with it, and it could become actually damaging?
I don't know.
You don't know.
I don't know who's doing their thing the best. I mean, because they're all competing and they've got billions of dollars and they're, you know, I don't I don't I mean it would take like a long time to like kind of figure out like really who's better on the margin. And I'm too busy to do that. And then as
Well, I
far
would
as
assume
like
just by using it, I
just
would
like
assume that you would
using
say, what do you think is the best one? I guess in terms of
I've been
LLMs.
using ChatGPT. And so that, I mean, forever since it came out. And so
Yeah,
I don't even like really compare. And so, so I don't even know. I've been meaning to stop using ChatGPT actually, because I don't, love the NSA on their board. But other than that, I don't like follow the gossip or, who said what about who. I just, I I don't have it. I don't have bandwidth for that kind of stuff.
yeah. I mean, I do find it interesting, but you probably are better off avoiding it. Um, yeah, you said something about did you say the NSA is on, or what did you say was on the board of OpenAI?
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
The NSA?
a former like chairman of the NSA or something like that. Like, all I had to hear is that they're connected with the NSA in any way, and I'm out. But
The
I'm
NSA,
not
the
out yet
NSA,
because it's too. It's I just haven't done the work to get off of it and start using something else. But
the
uh,
NSA being the what does that stand for?
National Security Agency, I think.
So you think they could be exploiting it or like using it to like track data on people or something?
This is the most. Um, this is the most valuable thing that anybody has right now is AIs, and because it has all the data, has all the information from everybody's talking to it. and everybody's leaking information about themselves and everything in the world. So the AI language models that are big are getting all that information, and knowledge is power, right? So obviously, like the hierarchy of power, the government wants in on this information. So they're going to get it some way or another, right? And so anyway, yeah.
I feel like that's a whole another topic that I would be interested in knowing, because I think you said something about you being a libertarian, right?
Yeah, yeah, I kind of have that leaning attitudes in that way.
Yeah. How do you feel about someone like Peter Thiel? Was isn't he a libertarian?
You know, other people, I have a problem with people. I don't pay attention to people. I've
Yeah. You don't
heard
like
his
people?
name. I'm sure I've seen him say some words on some video clip or something. I actually don't really even know who he is. And that's
Yeah.
true of most humans on the planet, even the famous ones, like I just don't know. I just don't know.
But I mean,
Uh,
isn't it probably important knowing who they are in terms of what you're doing, because you want to like be able to predict what is Elon Musk going to do next? What is
yeah, you
right?
would think they don't matter as much. I mean, and when they do matter, like the AIs will figure it out. So it's actually a pre-optimization that I don't have to do to pay attention to them right now.
Yeah. So in terms of I guess just in general, not necessarily with the people, but the AI being a positive thing or negative, would you say it's positive, negative?
It's the way of the world and the natural order, like we said, like we're gonna build it. And so, it's a lion positive or negative. It's kind of like, well, if you're a gazelle, you know, you might not like lions, but I think they're pretty cool, and I'm human. So um, I think we need to let things evolve, the way they're going to go.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a whole nother topic, but in terms of AI safety or whatever. But
Uh,
so now I want to get into consciousness, which is what I actually originally wanted to get into, but
sure.
also very interested in AI. So in terms of consciousness, and then also I guess relating to AI consciousness, um, you kind of tack these two together. One, do you think AI will be able to become conscious? And then two, what are your thoughts on consciousness and metaphysics? And I saw you post on like the simulation theory. Um, so do you think we're living in a simulation? And if it is the simulation, what kind of, I guess, consciousness are we living in? I don't even know if the simulation would be like its own separate consciousness theory, or if it's just kind of, you know what I mean? Or if it's like, but yeah. So what are your thoughts on that?
Let's, I guess we'll start with the simulation because that seems the most concrete. So, are we living in a simulation or not? I think we have to, my perspective is that that's a question that doesn't make any sense. Um, because it has to be true. It has to be true, but it also can't be. Okay, so let me put it this way. When information comes into our bodies, it gets translated. We talked about that with the hands. We encode the data and some, we compress it down and then we decompress it when it gets to the brain. And we kind of try to figure out what that information was when it entered the hands, but we don't really know. And eventually, um, we come up with this model in our head of what the outside world is doing. And that model might not be accurate. Um, excuse me, that model is probably never 100% accurate. And so that means the model is a simulation, right? We're only looking at the model. We can't see anything, we can't feel anything that's not the model. So the model is a simulation. So we have to live in a simulation. We do live in a simulation, right? The model that we experience is the simulation. But then we say, well, okay, what about the data that came into our bodies? Is that kind of simulated? I don't know, because even the model of it coming into our bodies is just a model, and that might not be what's actually going on. And so there's no way to touch the real world. It's untouchable, it's unseeable. You can't see it, you can't describe it, you can't, but you can build a model, and that's the best you can do. And so the simulation question is kind of like, well, we're always stuck in a simulation. That's not ever gonna, nothing's ever gonna be different than that. But we're actually, you're real because you experience, right? I mean, that's kind of fundamental to being. Like, I think, therefore I am, like Descartes said. So, so there's a foundation to being that is somehow very intertwined with our experience, or like, we know we are. And so I don't think that can be simulated. How do you, I don't know, like the foundation doesn't seem like it's a simulation. Does that make sense? This is all very metaphysical and vague, and I'm probably not
Yeah.
doing a very good job, but
Yeah, no, but in terms of no, you are in terms of the simulation. When you say like we are in a simulation, that's for sure. Um, for one, I don't really necessarily know how we know that for sure, but I mean, I believe you, and I think you're right. But in terms of the simulation, do you think that it's this type of simulation where like we're in a video game type thing, where like somebody from another, I guess it would either be another potential planet or something, or even like maybe someone in the future, they started building simulations. They created us as either a video game or some sort of experiment or something that they can just watch. What do you think in terms? I mean, I know we don't know,
right.
but it's like what is your what do you think when you say the simulation? Is that what you mean? Like kind of like a video game type thing that somebody built?
Let's imagine that somebody built a video game and that we're all Sims, we're just whatever. And this is an alien species that's really, really advanced, and they have the hardware to compute every atom of our whole universe, and in real time. And it's wild simulation, right? Let's just pretend that's kind of what's going on. The data that is going into the simulation, right? That alien species, they're interacting with it, what that built it in the first place, right? This is like in a thought experiment. The data that's flowing into that simulation is coming from somewhere. It's coming from their world, right? And so, that world surrounds the simulation world, the simulated world. Um, it can only get data, information from their world. It can make up its own patterns and its own things, but my point is that if you play that out long enough, eventually I think you get to a situation where you say, the simulated world is going to look just like the real world. And we see that, video games, they evolve to have better and better graphics, just as an observation, and we're always trying to simulate the real world better and better and better and better. So if you take this out for an infinite amount of time, you realize that the experience of the Sims in the simulated world are going to look just like the experience of somebody who's not in a simulated world, who's in the alien world. And if that's the case, then it doesn't really matter if you're in the simulation or out of it, or conceptualize yourself as being simulated or not, because you would see the same thing in either case. So I don't know. Does that help? Does that make any
No,
sense?
yeah, it does. But so when you say the simulation, you base because I mean, like somebody like I just recently listened to like Donald Hoffman, Donald Hoffman,
Oh,
and
I have no idea
he,
who that guy
oh,
is.
you know who that is? Um, he's like a philosopher who basically came out with what you were saying.
Okay.
So I kind of assumed, I mean, I don't think he was necessarily the first one, but he's coming on saying that basically what you're saying is we've evolved for not truth, but survival or whatever. And what we're seeing, just like what you're saying, isn't necessarily what um is really out there. When I first heard him say that, I was like, oh well, that makes sense. Like when I look at this wall, it doesn't really look like the wall. I just see it as a wall because that's the way my eyes see, and I've just learned that for survival or whatever. But what he actually believes in is the simulation, but it's not the simulation in the sense that somebody like another civilization built us or created this simulation. It's more like he just thinks like the whole thing is like a simulation almost. I mean, it's kind of hard. I didn't really fully get it, understand his viewpoint. Besides that, almost kind of like the idealism, where like we're living like
Idealism.
in consciousness. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So basically that, but he kind of keeps referring to the headset. Like we have the headset on, and we're trying to get out. He's trying to get out of the headset or whatever. But do you believe? So that was my main question was like, do you believe that somebody, another civilization, created us, or do you just feel like there's a possibility that like we're just fully living in some sort of simulation that would be similar, I guess, to like idealism?
I probably you're breaking up a little.
Oh,
Uh,
am I?
are you good now? It looks like it's okay now.
Is it bad? Sorry.
I probably would uh I don't know. If I had to make a choice, with like a one word option, I'd probably go with idealism, something like that.
Over the that
Over
we
anything
over
concrete.
over that we were created by another species or whatever.
Right. Over anything like that. Because let's take our physical world, our physical universe, and we'll just pretend like our physical universe uh is the foundational base reality that exists. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And okay, there's no end to our physical universe. I mean, we have this Big Bang that happened 14 billion years ago or something. And so you could say, well, there's an edge out there. But if you traveled to the edge, like instantly, like right now, then, and you looked around, you got your space suit on and you're just looking around, you would see more universe, right? It would look just like it does here, right? It would just look like space and planets and suns and gravity and whatever. So it wouldn't be anything radical. It would just look like more universe. And if you then did it again instantly and went to the very edge of that universe, you'd you'd look around and you'd just see more universe. So we live in this infinite landscape of three-dimensional space, right? We can conceptualize it that way. And we could say the universe is infinite. It just goes on forever, forever and ever and ever and ever. So you could say, well, I'm going to point in one direction. I'm going to go outside at nighttime and I can see the stars, and I'm going to point in one direction. And if I could travel at instantaneous speeds in that direction, as fast as I want, I would eventually, instantly, but I would reach a place out there in this universe or this multiverse I would reach a place that has a solar system that looks just like ours. You know, I'm flying instantly through an infinite amount of space. I would eventually reach a planet that looks just like Earth. Now, I'd see lots of planets, but eventually I'd see one that's basically a replica of Earth. And the sun is a replica of the sun. And it's an exact copy. It looks exactly the same. And everything in the whole observable universe out there is exactly the same as our universe, right? You know, our observable universe right here. And so you could do that, and then you could turn around and point in the other direction, or any direction, and you could do the same thing. And so there's an infinite number of exact copies of our observable universe. And they're all over. There's an infinite number of them. They're very spread out. They're very far away. But if the universe is infinite in this thought experiment, then you would find as many as you want. So, and you would find every possible combination between, you know, maybe it's our exact universe with one blade of grass that is leaning the other direction or something, you know. So there's lots of these. So how do we know? You know, if this thought experiment, if we take it as like ground truth and we say, well, this is the fundamental existence, being, universe, or whatever, how do we know that we live in this observable universe and not any of the others? I mean, it kind of seems like they're all the same, right? But if they exist in time, then they can all evolve differently. And so my whole point to that is that even if you take like the most concrete materialist view of an infinite being, then you still get to a point where you find this kind of strange idealism pop up. You're all of those, you know, universes at once, right? You're all of them. And so I don't know if that helps, if that thought experiment seems to mean something to me. But maybe it's doesn't mean too much to anybody else.
No, it does. Like so basically it's like there's so much vastness out there, and there's like pretty much like because it's infinite, it's like repetitive. It seems like that would mean that it's more of like a conscious like a all consciousness as opposed to all material, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, taking it back to your example with the alien, thinking, well, what if an alien species has simulated our world? Another alien species could simulate our world as well. It could make the exact same simulation. And if that happened, which of those simulations would you be living in? Since they're exactly the same, you're kind of in both, right? I mean, you're experiencing the world, and both copies of you would be experiencing the exact same world, and they'd do the exact same thing, and they'd have the exact same thoughts. And so it doesn't really make any sense to say, well, I'm the one that's created by alien B rather than alien A. And so I don't know. It just these kind of thought experiments, they seem to imply to me that there are questions which we can ask that seem like they might have a real answer. Like, oh, I was created by alien species A. But it doesn't really make any sense because they can't really have an answer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean it's confusing, but yeah. Uh so in terms of so you don't really necessarily believe that like another alien species created this simulation. You just think that we are in a simulation, but it's really just consciousness, right? We're just how do you
That's
think
exactly right.
Do you have any idea that of how that consciousness kind of why it even all started in the first place? Yeah.
What it is to be conscious is to make concepts, and making concepts means you detect patterns and you put them in a box and you relate them to each other, and you have some kind of semantic map, which is a language, and that's it, right? Like that, to experience something means you're doing all that kind of stuff. And so there's no world that can be experienced other than models. And so we're always stuck in models, and consciousness is fundamentally a product of simulation then, or can only be experienced through a model, which is a simulation. So now, but the question of, well, okay, then that means consciousness is fundamental. And how did they come up with all these simulations in the first place, or something like that? My metaphysics um, is probably wrong, or I don't know, but the only way I've been able to make any kind of a semblance of sense out of this is to identify the foundation of awareness with the paradox of nothing. Um, in my mind, there's really um, a lot of we've been trying to figure this out forever, right? Like all the religious metaphysics, all the religious theologies, all the different kinds of Eastern, Western philosophies has always been trying to figure out, like, where did the universe come from? Like, why did it start? Why are we here? Like, what's going on? Like, how did this come into being? And so the Catholics and the classical theists and the Western thought that came out of all that said, okay, well, to get a handle on this, we're going to assume causation is the way everything is, which is an assumption of time. It's very practical. It's very practical to say causation is fundamental, just because we use time as a practical, foundation. So then they said, if causation is fundamental, then everything that happens has to be caused by something that came prior to it in time. So every cause, everything that happens makes new things that happen and was caused by something else. And so we have this train of causation that can go all the way back to what? And they say, well, there must have been a first mover, something that did something, but wasn't caused to do it. And we don't know what that is, but we're going to give it a name, first mover, and we're going to call it God. And that's kind of the answer that the Western mind has come up with for answering this question, like, why do we exist? And that's like, that's it. That's what we got. We don't. And then some other, real philosophers come along and they're like, well, actually, it's just absurd, like Kant and everything. And Descartes was like, we should probably be able to relate it to ourselves, because we're the ones, I'm the one experiencing reality, and I have no guarantee that anybody else is. And, so fundamentally, I know I'm real. There you go. Right. So we've kind of had some other thoughts about this, but that's the foundation in my mind, is that there's a first mover, there's a first cause. We don't know what it is, but we're going to give it a name, first cause, and be done with it, like, and move on with our lives, right? Like that's kind of what it seemed like happened. So when I was learning all this, I thought, well, surely we can do like better than just, you know, giving it a label, and then it implies something's wrong with the model, and if you want to do, if you want to stick with that model, then we can probably amend it with something that's, a little more descriptive. And so I thought about it, and I came up with my own metaphysics that I use, and it's not unlike all the other metaphysics that I've encountered, since. And it's the idea that, okay, what is that first cause? If we just assume that we'll just go with that model, there was a first cause, what is it? And I think we have to ask, what is existence? Like, how do we define existence? It caused all of this existence, assumedly. So how do we define existence? And existence is kind of what we can see. This is how we define it. I mean, science goes into that, and they say, well, if you can't measure it and you can't have any, there's no reason to infer that it exists because it makes no measurable expression. You can't see it, touch it, all that kind of stuff. Then it doesn't exist, right? And so that's kind of science's view. Like, that's how we define existence. And so I said, well, from a philosopher point of view, which deals with, like, by definition, and tries to make everything as logical as possible, you would have to say that existence exists in relation to non-existence. We define it by saying, well, it's not nothing. I don't know what it is, but it's not nothing. And then if you get to that point, you then have to say, well, nothing can't have any kind of actual expression. It's not allowed to exist, because if nothing itself, the what we define as nothing, by the label of it, if it did exist, then nothing would exist, right? Like, the whole universe would not be here. And so that means it would have an actual expression. It would undo its own meaning because it would actually be something. It would be everything that exists. And so nothing isn't allowed to exist. And we get that. I mean, nature abhors a vacuum and all that. So nothing, the concept of nothing is not allowed to have an expression at all, right? It's not allowed to be expressed. It's not allowed to be something. So we say, well, that means existence exists in relation to something that doesn't exist. It gives it a foundation that implies it's not real. And so that actually makes perfect sense when we start to realize that everything we experience, which is how science defines existence, has to be a model. It can't actually be a real thing. It has to be a model of what could be a real thing. And so that implies the simulation as a fundamental aspect of reality. So I took this down to kind of the same place Kant did when he said, everything's absurd. His absurdism idea. I didn't use those words. I didn't know about him, but I used the word paradox. Since the concept of nothing being a concept without an expression, a pointer without something to point to, since it's fundamentally like a paradoxical idea, it seems to me that it's that paradox that we should put in place of the concept of the first mover, right? It's that paradox which generates the world, or which makes the world. And then we can look at our experience and notice everything's a model, and we see the paradox being expressed in that way. So I know this was a long explanation of my kind of homegrown metaphysics or whatever, but really it all comes down to identifying the source of being as nothing, which is a paradoxical concept and not something you can probably get away from. And which means it's a model that isn't true, right? But there's no other model that can do better, I don't think. I mean, you have to have some kind of expression of the paradox. So I hope some of that made some sense.
Yeah, I mean it's all very confusing, and it's all I mean to a certain extent I'm almost kind of like, why even think about it? I mean, it's obviously interesting to talk about, but it's kind of like, why even think about it, because it doesn't matter, I guess, unless you get to the point where you can solve it, and maybe, AI will eventually get to that point. But a couple of things is like yeah, like, well, first of all, in terms of like nothing, um like if a rock, you know doesn't, like, what's it like to be a rock, and it's like nothing, right?
Yeah.
So I guess that leads into kind of like panpsychism. Like, do you feel like everything to a certain extent is conscious? um because like you said, it's like, you can't really describe nothingness, which is nothingness. um so yeah, do you feel like everything is conscious on a very, very kind of like low level, like panpsychism? Do you believe in that or no?
I think it makes sense to model the universe as conscious. I do. Um, uh, I think it makes sense. Um, which means computers can be conscious, you know, and the more sophisticated we make their AI feedback mechanisms, the more conscious they can become. Right? They could become as conscious as we are. And so I don't think it implies any kind of real world or practical, problems, logical problems, logical, you know, undoing of itself. So, so I do think like you could say, well, why am I conscious of the experience that's happening inside my head? And Max Tegmark has this information integration theory where he says, well, let's try to come up with a mathematical explanation for that. And he matches it to a description of how integrated is the information in your head. It's very integrated, right? It's your hemispheres are always talking to itself, and there's all these feedback mechanisms and loops and all that kind of stuff. So you have so you have an expression of consciousness here. Whereas the rock, sometimes it gets thrown, sometimes it falls down the cliff, sometimes it gets melted by a volcano, very little is happening to the rock. So there's not a lot of information flow, feedback with the rest of its environment in that, so you could call that consciousness on the sliding scale, but it's really quite far down. And if there's something that it is to be a rock, it's probably more like there's something like it is to be all rocks that exist, something more like that. I mean, I think you can, I kind of get into thought experiments. Like that's like, I guess, where I go with everything. So I'm always just trying to imagine what it is like, or how could we do some logic on this. Um, so I've thought about like, what is it like to be an ant? You know, they don't, I mean, do they even have eyes? I think they just have antennas. And so they're just around there smelling, right? and they communicate with each other through smell or, pheromones and whatever else, right? So and so if there's something that it's like to be an ant, I mean, what are they doing? Because they work really well together. They build these ant colonies and all that, and when they have to figure out something to do, like, okay, this piece of meat is really huge, and so we got to all work together to move it closer to the thing, you know, uh, they come up with solutions and they figure it out. And you can ask yourself, like, okay, well, what is it like to be an ant? They got this little tiny brain. If I was going to try to anthropomorphize them or kind of empathize with them or simulate what it might be to be a human simulating an ant's experience, I might say, okay, I'm the other ants are passing me by all the time, and I'm smelling them all the time. And everybody has a different signature because I'm really good at smelling things, right? I'm like a dog. I can really tell who's who. And so as soon as I smell someone, I can smell all the other ants that they've been around recently on them, or maybe they message me with some kind of pheromone or something, right? And so it seems like what the ant is actually doing in its head is making a model of where all the other ants have been, because it's continually coming in contact with them. It is really good at smelling, and anyway, it's making a model of where all the ants are and what they're doing. And I don't know anything about ants. Like, who knows, right? But I mean, some professional probably knows more. But we can kind of infer that that's a large part of whatever model they're making. And so if that's true, then that's all that they're ever looking at, is like, where are all the other ants? And they probably don't identify as an individual ant or have much of a conception of what that means. They probably, since the only thing that they're ever looking at is the shape and activity and needs of the colony, they probably identify as the colony. Kind of like how our neurons in our head all work together to probably identify as the colony of neurons in our head, like one entity. And so consciousness, I guess the point of that is that it has layers and layers and layers. And so you can't get away from, just like you can't get away from experience being a model or experiencing only a model, it doesn't seem like you can get away from consciousness being intertwined with an individual concept and a group concept, or that the concept of identity is intertwined with those, and that identity is implied by what you're experiencing at all times anyway. I don't know if any of this makes sense, but when I think of consciousness and panpsychism and idealism and everything, I kind of see it as it's probably got lots and lots of layers. And where the information is integrated the most, I think Max is onto something, even though I have no idea how his math works, but the concept sounds right to me. That where the information is integrated the most, maybe in a particular way or certain types of feedback loops, that's where consciousness is expressed.
So Max Tegmark, I listened to him recently on like Sean Carroll's podcast. You know Sean Carroll?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so is he a would he be an idealist or would he be a materialist? Max Tegmark?
I don't know. I don't know too much. I just heard that one idea of his. Um,
Yeah.
and I don't know, at some level it doesn't really matter. because let's say I identify as a materialist. You can come to all these conclusions from the same way, kind of like how we looked at an infinite physical material landscape universe. Um, you can still come to the same conclusions just in a roundabout way. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I hadn't even heard of idealism because it's kind of weird. I feel like that term, I guess maybe isn't used very much in the West or something, but it's like, even when I like Googled it, it was kind of like somewhat hard to find. But I had a guy from Saudi Arabia on a while ago talking about consciousness and also like near death experiences and all that kind of stuff. And
Cool.
he was the first one to tell me about idealism, and like I didn't even know that theory existed. Like I knew about panpsychism, and I even thought, and then like yeah, I even like knew of the idea of like consciousness only being in your mind, which I don't even know. I don't even know what that theory would be called. If like if consciousness is only in my mind, would that be like brain in a vat type thing or something?
That's called solipsism.
Solipsism, which is like basically only in my mind. But the way that I view things is essentially, I guess, would be materialism, just for the fact that like when I see this wall, I can knock on it, and I don't really have any good reason to believe that like this is just like consciousness or whatever. And then
Sure.
yeah, and I'm not saying that I'm right. It just that seems like it makes the most sense to me. Then also like you brought up, and this has been said forever, like you said, I know, therefore I am. That like I know that I'm real, but I don't know if you're real. But like I don't really have any good reason to believe that like you're not real. And it's like you could say why, and it's like, well, every I don't have any good reason to believe anything is not real because everything that happens in my life, like there is a definite like system to it and order. And it's like it's one thing if like I so like weird stuff was happening, like where it was like I was talking to somebody about something, and then when I brought it up to them later, they're like, "We never had that." I don't know, you know what I mean? I mean that type of stuff does happen, but it's probably just more of a memory thing. I don't really have any real reason to believe that like you don't exist or something, or like you're just consciousness. Um, with that being said, like going back to like if you want, you can add to that, but then also with like the nothingness. I mean, I feel like there's so many directions I can like take with this, but it's like it's kind of hard to like it's definitely without a doubt hard to nail down.
Oh yeah, I
But
know.
in terms of nothingness, that kind of can lead me to the question of where like what do you think happens to us when we die? Like do you think there is true just like when I went back to like the rock, even though that could be somewhat conscious, do you believe like when we die it's almost like we're dead, but I guess according to panpsychism, like there are parts of our body that is still conscious, or I guess just the easier question would be like, do you believe any type of like life after death type thing, or what's your views on life after death?
Death. Death is an interesting concept because a lot like nothing, it can't be experienced. You can't have a memory of being dead. You can't you can never know that you've been dead. You can never know it. You can say, well, okay, I can infer that I didn't exist before I was born, and I was like dead or something, like I don't know. But you can't have a memory of it. You can't remember being dead. And so I think that has something to say about death. Like if you can't know it, then it almost seems like it puts it in a superposition to me. Like if you do the double slit experiment, and you don't know which slit the you know electron or the photon went through, and then you look at the paper, you see a pattern that's wavy. You know, you don't see two straight lines or one line or anything. You see like several lines, and it's all spread out, and you see the result that it went through both of them. That's the result you actually see. You don't know which one it went through. It went through both. There's no way to know. It went through both of them. And if there is a way to know, or if you do know, you measured it, then it only went through one. And so then you get, these two lines on the paper. To me, that experiment is not just saying something about light, like, oh, light's weird, if you're not looking, it does weird stuff. I think that's saying something about everything. Is that if you're not looking at it, or if you can't get the information about it, then it was actually in a superposition at that time. And that probably goes for everything. Now, the world, we're all kind of watching each other, and then we interact with each other. And so the information is very available. So we all seem to have very concrete, real expressions, right? But when it comes to something like death, it's an unknowable thing because you can't experience it. I'm not saying it's unknowable to know if it happens. It's unknowable to know it, to be it, to experience it, or to have any memory of it. And all we can experience are memories, right? The past is, what we experience as being happening right now already happened because it takes time to build that model and figure it out. So we only experience things that happened in the past and memories. And we can't remember being dead. It's impossible. So it seems like that puts us in a superposition when we're dead. That death is a superposition, that it's not actually what a material reductionist might think of as death. Because if it is, then does that make sense? Then it can't be, because the definition of how they would define death means you can't experience it.
Yeah, what do you mean by superposition? I mean, I've heard the term before where it's, I mean, that whole thing is very confusing and interesting to me, the quantum physics.
Yeah.
But how, like, when they look at two molecules that they're kind of in two places at once, right? Or they're kind of like bouncing back and forth. So what do you mean by it would be like a superposition, like when we're dead? Like it's almost just kind of like it's almost just an answer for
Superposition,
like we don't know or something.
excuse me, it means undefined, or it means undefinite or not definite. It means, let's take Schrodinger's cat. I mean, everybody knows about the cat. Schrodinger said, look, this stuff is weird, like superposition, the idea that if you're not looking at something, it's taking on the expression of all of its possible expressions at the same time. And so, um, so, so he says, let's do a thought experiment. Let's put a cat in a box. We won't look at it. The box is disconnected from the whole universe. Nobody can see inside. And all the information is, disconnected from the universe. In that case, that means the cat has to be in a superposition. We put it in there with some, cesium or some poison that has a 50-50% chance of killing the cat, right? So if we put the cat in the box with the poison, the random poison, then while we're not looking, the cat is both alive and dead at the same time. And we call that a superposition. It's in the position of all of its possible states. It's not chosen one. It's in all of its possible states. It's in that position, a superposition. And it's all at once. So it doesn't make any sense to say, well, is it alive or is it dead? That's a question that doesn't mean anything if you don't know about the cat, right? If you don't look in the box. The only question is, I guess, what are all of its possible states? And then you know it's superposition. So it's both alive and dead, like for real, like both of those are true. And they seem like you can't have both of them be true, but that's what the double slit experiment implies, is that if you're not looking at which slit the photon went through, then it interacts with itself. It actually went through both of them. Even though we conceptualize the photon as a particle, when we're not looking, it's not a particle. It's in a superposition of everything that every place that it could be. So,
But so in terms of that, like the Schrodinger's cat thing, like, do you really? It's kind of confusing because it's like, do you or like do physicists or whatever like really believe that? Like, if you're not looking at the cat could be alive or dead. Like that's literal.
that's that's literal to me.
So
Yeah.
like you believe almost kind of like in a video game how like things render or whatever. Like
Yes.
if you're
Yeah.
looking straight, you see something, but you don't see what's over here until you look over here. So
Right.
that's essentially how the physics works.
Of being. Yeah. Like
So
the
it would make the most sense to actually believe if that's true. It seems like it would almost make the most sense to be like we are in some sort of computer simulation, right? Because I mean, it seems like it makes sense because that's how it works in a computer.
right.
Um, but the thing is with that experiment, isn't it only like the tiniest little molecule or particles or whatever that this is happening to? It's not necessarily the whole cat. Like I kind of feel like maybe this is happening within the smallest particles of my body, but like I'm still really here always, right? And same with you. It's not like if you turn away, like I'm not here or whatever, right? It doesn't happen with like a massive object, right?
Macro level object. Uh, it doesn't happen with a macro level object because it's really difficult to
Well, I mean,
isolate all the information.
by macro you mean like me.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, okay.
Not micro, microscopic and macroscopic.
Yeah, yeah. For some reason, I was thinking macro was
Yeah, so it doesn't
was
happen
smaller.
on these big scales because it's hard to isolate all the information. It's easier to isolate all the information on a photon because it's really tiny, right? But on these macroscopic scales, um, it's just harder to isolate them. This is kind of the problem they have with building quantum computers. Is the more qubits that they add in, the harder it is to make sure they're all kind of isolated from everything that exists. So,
But you think this is also happening with me? Like literally, if you turned away, and then when you're turned away, like I'm not really here. I almost kind of like render as you look at me. Is that what you believe?
sort of,
Sorry, is there any like delay or lag on my end?
a little bit, but it's okay.
Okay, okay. I mean, yeah, because as long as I can hear you and I can see you, but I just want to make sure that it's not all like weird for you.
No, it's good.
Okay.
So, there's other observers in the world, right? Like in theory. So other people can see you. So you say, well, what if there were no other observers in the world? There's no other humans, there's no other animals. Would I still exist? You wouldn't exist in relation to them. You would only exist in relation to you, but you've got this brain that has memory and it has feedback mechanisms, and so it can recall you, it can observe the body, and so you'd still exist like that, right? You'd still be able to observe yourself. But what happens when you don't have that ability and nothing else has that ability either? It seems like everything's in a superposition at that point. So if you go into death, in relation to you, the universe is in a superposition, or in relation, if the universe is, trying to look at you, you're in a superposition. Does that I mean, that's kind of how I conceptualize it at this point. Still trying to figure out death. But
Yeah, but it still wouldn't really necessarily. I almost feel like saying that it's just in a superposition like wouldn't really be an answer. And like obviously like you don't need an answer because like nobody knows. But if you're saying that I would be in a superposition, I don't even really know what that would mean in terms of whether or not I would still be conscious or whatever.
it probably means, I have no idea what it means. But one thing I do know that it means, just like one aspect of it, um, it's hard. This is a hard question, because they asked the question, well, what's the speed of light? And so they figured it out and they measured it, and um, they realized that they could only measure light by it having made a loop back to them. It has to originate here and then be bounced back, and now I can measure. We don't have any way to measure light that hasn't originated from us. And so what we can measure is the two-way speed of light. We say, well, it went out a mile and it came back, and this is how long it took. And so, we divide that by two. We say it goes this far in a mile. And so we can measure the two-way speed of light. We actually don't have the ability, like by definition, like just logically speaking, we could never have the ability to measure light's speed in one direction, just having gone out from us. If it doesn't come back, we can't measure it.
Well, what
So,
about like the Big Bang? Like, doesn't like the Big Bang, the light from the Big Bang just come like to us,
well, the
or
Big
does it?
Bang happened like everywhere. And so it didn't happen in a different place. It happened at every point in space all at once. I mean,
But I mean, let's just say if we're looking at like Mars or something, um, doesn't that light like come from Mars to us, or does it have to kind of like come from us, hit Mars, and then come back?
if we want to measure the speed, yeah, I guess there's only one way to do it, and that's a two-way speed. We can only measure that. I wish I really understood this concept and all the, reasons why it's true
Yeah,
better. But that's basically the limits of my knowledge, is that we can only do that, which means to ask the question,
yeah.
uh, does the two, what is the one-way speed of light? It's kind of a question without an answer. Like it doesn't even make sense to ask the question. We can come up with an answer and just say, well, it's two-way speed divided by two, right? But that's just an assumption. It doesn't mean anything. So in many ways, the one-way speed of light is in a superposition as well. It is, and it doesn't, we would still see the same universe no matter what the speed is within certain limitations.
Okay, so that's basically saying by that reasoning, that's kind of like saying like we wouldn't be able to see anything besides from our own perspective, essentially, right?
Right.
Like light isn't necessarily coming to us. It's like us looking out and then having it come back to us, which kind of means that it's like all consciousness. Is that kind of like what that's saying?
Well, I think the point that I was trying to make, maybe, I don't know, was that there are like logical things that we can't know. And knowing the limitations of those, we can say all those things that we can't know, we could call them a superposition. Whatever, the actual value is, we would still see the same universe no matter what, right? And so um, the real understanding is that there is no whatever the actual value is. The actual value doesn't exist. So this is something I've been trying to get my head around for a while, and it's not been easy, but it's where I go when I think about what is death, right? I think it's impossible to know it. Therefore, it's all the things that it could be, not therefore it's something and I just don't know it. Therefore, we actually know that it's not something that we actually don't know. We already know. We can infer some information from the fact that we can't know it. We can infer that it actually is everything that it could be. I don't, like that answer seems to like not have any meaning, but I think it does have a meaning. It's not something specific. We know that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this whole this all of this talk is very confusing and hard to understand. But yeah, that makes sense. So in terms of like, I've heard that like Einstein proved that like in terms of like the light thing, he basically obviously came up with the idea of like everything is relativity or general relativity, which I don't fully understand. But wasn't he saying something along the lines of like um yeah, I mean, I'm not going to be able to explain this, but basically gravity isn't like a force that like kind of like is beaming down on the earth, but it bends time and space. And I don't really fully understand that. Um do you understand that? Like, are you
I
able to
would
explain
say
that?
I don't, but I um like like it's so funny. Existence has to be relative, right? Like it's the way you define existence has to be relative to something, and we already talked about, well, yeah, it's relative to nothing, right? So so relativity is like a fundamental aspect of being, and Einstein was able to quantify that in terms of, these different equations and all that. Pretty cool, right? But even he, in one of his papers, he even said, we're going to make the assumption, just bringing this back to the one-way speed of light thing. We know that we can't know the one-way speed of light, but we're going to assume it's x because, or c, I guess, I don't know, because we know the two-way speed of light, and we're just dividing that by 2, so we'll use that as our equation. And so, yeah, like this has been known even since Einstein, right? Like he knew that. And so, yeah, all of his relativity stuff, I don't understand it. I'm not some amazing physicist, but I do think it's interesting that that existence has to be fundamentally relative. And so I think it's cool that he was able to show that in the math. As far as the bending of space-time and stuff like that, it's wild. Like I don't get it, but it's just a model, and it's a very useful model. And so I think we should try to understand whatever model is useful, and definitely try to use the useful models, because no model is actually true. And so really the usefulness is the best we can do.
Yeah, like in terms of I feel like we're going like I'm going like way off on a tangent here, which is fine. But in terms of truthfulness, um, you know how like I think it's like the postmodern thing where it's like there is no truth or whatever. Like
Yeah.
I don't really like that, and then I guess I'll just stick with that. I don't like really fully understand that. Like obviously there's no truth with some things, but there obviously is some truth. There is truth with other things, correct? Like it's like, do you believe that there is no truth, or
But it
like
just means truth is relative.
to every person?
Well, yeah, to everything. Like um, you could say, I've built a different mathematics where I use the symbol three, the three symbol, you know, and I use it as my number two, right? So 1 + 1 = 3 in my math, and so by definition, you make that mathematical language. Um, it's true. 1 + 1 = 3, right? And so that's probably a bad example because it's saying the same thing as a different language. And so, but I would say the idea is that, yeah, truth is relative to those that observe it, and probably the languages and the models that they create.
Yeah, but I kind of feel like that is like somewhat um I don't really know if like reductive would be the right word, but it's like I understand what you're saying, and you're obviously correct, but it's like I kind of feel like it's like, but it's like, yeah, 1 + 1 could equal 3, but it does equal 2. Or like if I say like I just turned on this light or whatever, it's kind of like
Yeah.
I feel like there are certain things that like you can just prove, right? But then you know what I mean?
Yes, yes, yes. And there are. I think what might be most interesting here is the idea of epistemology. Because if we want to say, like Descartes said, like, what can I know for real? Right? What can I know for real? What's actually true? And so if we're really trying to get down to saying, what is the truth? I think we have to follow his line of reasoning, and we get to the point where we're like, what can I deny? What might not be true? You know? Um, I've been in dreams where I thought, well, this is true by definition, and so this is fundamentally real. And then I wake up and I'm like, it doesn't make any sense. But I was completely convinced that it made sense in the dream. And so can we trust our own reasoning? Can we trust our own linguistic reasoning or logical reasoning or anything like that, or mathematical language? Maybe, but I don't think we should just assume we can trust it. It's an assumption that we can trust it as being true. It's a really good assumption because it's been true for a long time, but we can't, fundamentally it's an assumption. And so he goes down and he says, what is the thing that is not an assumption? Is there anything that I can put a name on that's not an assumption? And I think the realization that you exist can't be denied because it's that you exist, right? Now, if you say, well, I actually don't think I have any conscious experience, okay, I'm going to trust you. And I guess you don't have a conscious experience, you're just an automaton. But I don't think anybody would say that because, they probably do exist. They probably think they're real.
Well,
So, I mean, you have a subjective experience, I'm assuming.
yeah. I mean, there are some people who believe that consciousness is an illusion, though, right? So, like, I think that I'm.
Descartes or Dennett,
Does she believe in that?
Daniel Dennett.
He believes in that.
Well, he did.
Not anymore though.
Well, he passed away.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I mean, like when I'm seeing you now, um, I guess I don't even know how you would really explain that, but it's kind of like I'm not really conscious, but I think like for some reason I think I am. Like, how does that make sense? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it doesn't make
And
sense.
and he did really believe that that was like his firm belief was that consciousness is illusion.
Daniel Dennett seemed to, I think. I mean, I didn't read anything he ever wrote, but you know, that was his claim to fame, I think. It's a weird thing to say. I don't know how you can really mean anything by saying that.
Yeah, I mean, it almost seems like it would be. Yeah, I mean, I guess it kind of you can kind of say that like if you programmed an AI to like think it's conscious, but like it's really not or something. Like I don't know how to explain that.
Yeah.
But anyways, I think
I
you were still talking about the I was just adding in that some people do believe that it's an illusion, I guess. But you were talking about yeah, you were just saying that,
well, even I believe it's an illusion because if you want to broaden the definition of illusion to mean it's a model, you know, like we've mentioned already, then sure, you know, I guess you could say it that way. It's an illusion. That's like saying we exist because of a paradox. Um, or if you want to broaden that idea of paradox to say, well, existence is just absurd, then you can go there too. Um, you know, all these models, uh, I think most of the time we're saying the same thing with different words. Most people are all the time. So, but but what you're saying is like it doesn't make too much sense to believe that you're not conscious, that you don't have a conscious experience when you can directly experience having a conscious experience. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So we can take that as our foundation and say, well, I don't know what it means. I don't know why I have this experience, and I don't know if it's simulated or, you know, whatever. I don't know. And I don't know, you know, how to interpret the experience, but it seems like there is one, therefore I am. Like I can take that as my foundational real, I can trust that, right? That's I am. I am. And so that's the foundation. That's the that's the epistemological foundation that I have. So I say, I can't deny that one. I am, and I can't deny it. And beyond that, I then can say, in fact, if I'm searching for truth, that's all I got for real. But everything beyond that seems to come in layers where you can say, maybe your first layer is you say, well, I can believe something is true. I can accept it as truth. Sorry. I can accept it as being true if it doesn't contradict itself, or maybe we'll say if it implies itself, if it's a true by definition, if the way I define the term two and plus and one work together to mean that 1 + 1 = 2, then it's true by definition. And so I can trust it as being true as much as I can trust anything else. I can't experience it being true like I experience myself being a being, but I can at least trust that it's true by definition. I can realize that. And if anything's true, that's true, right? Okay, so that's your first layer. And then it seems like the second layer is saying, um, that's just like logic, you know, is saying, well, I'm going to build on top of that. And as long as I don't make a mistake, I can build out entire mathematical systems and logical proofs and all this kind of stuff. As long as I haven't made a mistake somewhere, then I can infer a lot of true statements that are true by definition. And that's my next layer. And so I start adding these onto each other. And then your next layer says, okay, so that's like math and maybe philosophy if you can swing it. Eventually you get to saying, okay, I have to look outside of things that are true by definition and make contact with, the real expression of reality that I'm experiencing. And then I'll try to um, infer what's true through observation and experimentation. And so that's your layer of science that says, I've learned a lot of stuff from math and all these true by definition things. Now I'm going to try to apply them to the real world and see what I can believe is true about the real world. And I have a process for that, that's the scientific method and all that. So then we get into the realm of science and trying to map the external world to make sense, right? That's just modeling the world is all that is. And then, at each successive layer of this, you say, I'm making more and more assumptions. At the beginning, I only made one assumption. The assumption that, things that are true by definition kind of make sense, that I should assume they're true, right? I mean, the logical assumption, right? And when I start adding layers to that logic, I have to say, I have to make another assumption that says, I haven't made any mistakes in my reasoning. And so that's now I've made two assumptions. And then when I get to the real world and mapping the real world, I have to make more assumptions. Is the data that I'm seeing correct? Did I make a mistake in my memory, recording the data? I have to make more assumptions about is my process of experiment. I make a lot of assumptions when I get to science. And then you start to go further out. The next layer is like conjecture, right? Like I don't really know X, Y, or Z, but it's got to be something like this, right? So you get to like a realm of conjecture, which is kind of beyond science. You're like, I'm not really sure. I could explore it, but whatever. Eventually, I think you get to a point in this epistemological map where you get to the edge where you say, I have no evidence for or against a lot of statements that could be made. And so therefore, I have no idea, right? I have no idea. Which just means all of those things are in a superposition in my map. I don't know if, who knows? Maybe I don't have the right map, but the way I model things is when it gets to that point, it just means, yeah, all of them are true somehow, a little bit, I guess. And so beyond that, where you say, yeah, any of these possibilities could be true, and I have no idea which one, you get to a realm where you say, actually, I can make statements that cannot be true because they contradict themselves. And so that's kind of the true by definition, cousin. They contradict themselves and therefore they're not true. And I think that's the end. Like that's if you can model all of truth somehow and say, well, where is this truth? It's relative to you fundamentally because it's on that map where you say, I'm at the center, I am. And I take that as my fundamental truth. And so I don't know, does that kind of help? That's how I kind of model the epistemological space.
It's all complicated, but it does help. And in terms of like saying, like I've heard somebody say like you can't prove something, you can only like disprove something. Like
Yeah.
what would that mean? Like how would you be able to disprove something as opposed to prove it? You know what I mean?
Well, kind of the Eastern thought has that same idea where it says of God, of being, of existence, of reality, of the void, of whatever. Of God, you can only say neti neti, which is you can only say not this, not that. You can't ever point to what being is because you can't touch it. You can only experience your model of reality. Um, so you can say, well, it's not this, it's not that, but you actually can't say what it actually is. So I think that's probably related to what you're thinking.
Do you think we'll ever, like, back to the AI thing? Like, do you think we'll ever get to a point where the AI will be able to, I guess, officially prove everything?
It'll be able to prove as much as it could prove, but I think that's pretty limited, because I think a lot of it is beyond observation, beyond we don't even have the data. There's no way to get the data. Like the one-way speed of light, there's no answer to the question. And I think a lot of the times we as humans, we think there's an answer to questions that don't make any sense. And that's where we kind of get confused a lot. And so that's why I care so much about epistemology, or kind of asking the question up front, what can I know? And if I can't know it, then I'm not going to waste my time thinking about it or conjecturing about it or something like that. I'm going to try to know what I can know before I know things, right? And I think that's a much more limited space than most people assume. And therefore, I think the AI can, map it just fine, but it probably won't have all the answers that people are looking for, right? The AI
You
will
don't
be
think
like,
like
well, that's
ever?
unknowable, so I don't have an answer for that.
You don't think like ever? Like even in 1,000 years, we'll never get to a point where we like not even everything, but like we just kind of were able to go back, like I said, and see what happened at the beginning, and then also potentially, I guess, to the future.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, I think you could do stuff like that. You could be like, make me the best possible, expression of the year 6 million years ago or whatever, right? And it'll say, well, I don't have a lot of data about that, but I'll make something about, that appropriately integrates everything that we do know about that particular moment in time. And so the stars will be correct, or as correct as we can get them. The erosion on the mountains will be just about right. So it'll approximate as best it could any physical, reality. Sure.
but I mean, that's still not like proving it. You know what I mean? I mean
Yeah.
like proving. Will we ever be able to like literally
I don't think so.
prove?
No,
No,
no.
no. And like, do you think that all this philosophy stuff, like I said, I think it's really interesting and I like talking about it, but do you think there's any like practicality to it in terms of the real world? Like if you're thinking on a higher level philosophical, if you're thinking on a philosophical level higher up or whatever, like do you like what we're talking about? Do you think it's kind of like practical in the world, or
I think it is practical.
yeah,
Especially with like epistemology. Yeah, because I grew up in the Mormon church. So I grew up indoctrinated in religion. And I was like, wow, okay, I guess this is it. And I really believed it. I wasn't like a moderate. Like a lot of kids, most people are like, yeah, sure, okay, yeah, whatever, I'm gonna live my life. Not me. I was like, this is it for real. Okay, I'll accept it. So, um, so I really know what it's like to kind of be crazy. So, if you don't have a map of epistemology, like the one I outlined, or any kind of idea about it, then you don't know what the limits of your knowledge are. And so you can be taken in by, you have no armor. You know, somebody can come and sell you, whatever they want, and you'll buy it because you don't know any better. And so I think it does have a lot of practical use case, I mean, it's armor for me against uh, indoctrination, right? Like I discovered that. So that's pretty big. That's pretty useful. So very practical. I think it does have a lot of practical considerations.
Yeah. Do you think there's any practicality? Because I mean, I was raised Christian, and do you think there's any practicality to religion? Because I mean, if you
Sure.
kind of if you kind of think about it, it's like even though you may or may not believe it, like if like a lot of people believe, like, well, if you believe in Christianity, then I guess the ultimate goal is to be like to strive to be the best person so that you can go to heaven.
Right.
And that seems like it kind of makes sense. Like you're saying, it's not necessarily, it might not be true, but at least like you're trying to live a good life or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And yeah,
totally.
yeah,
In community, I mean, we're not just all disembodied, like logical computers run around here. We're humans. So we have a lot of social needs and all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, church has its place. It's great. Yeah.
yeah. What do you feel about the Mormon church now? Like, do you feel like it even has its place, or do you feel like it's almost kind of too crazy or whatever?
It doesn't have a place in my life. Like I don't go to church, that kind of stuff. Um, but it's definitely has a place um, in the lives of everybody around me. So it's all right.
Yeah. So, and we'll probably have to like wrap up soon, but in terms of any other, I mean, there's so many directions that I could take this, and it's like we only have so much time, but just everything that we talked about, you know what I mean? Like, there's so many more questions I could potentially have, but it's like we only have so much time. But one last question would be, in terms like of metaphysics, do you believe in any other types of metaphysics? I mean, that word's kind of like a hard word to pin down, but um do you believe in anything else besides like the consciousness stuff? Are you into any other types of metaphysical stuff?
Hmm. Do you have any like examples or anything you might be thinking?
Well, I mean, you probably know more about it than me, but like when like you put on there, metaphysics, it's kind of like you tell me, like what were you referring to? I guess it would be, yeah. I mean, honestly, I don't even I don't even know. But it's like the only real one that comes to mind would be like that's actually practical seems to be like consciousness. Anything else kind of comes off as like occultish or something, right? Like yeah, like what else were you referring to when you said metaphysics?
Okay. Um, okay. All right. Let me just think. So when I try to define metaphysics, everybody's just trying to figure out like what's going on. Like and so when I think of that, I think about it in the same context as the religious person thinks about their theology. And so they're trying to come to fundamental truths about the universe in which they live. And and I think what happens is you'll have a mystic, you'll have a philosopher, you'll have somebody that has an aha moment and is like, ah, I get it, right? But they can't really put it into words because it's too big. And so they come up with these concepts like heaven or hell or a bunch of other stuff. And they realize certain things about their experience being human and what experience is in its very nature. And so then they build a religion around it, or they influence the religion that they're in, and these concepts get really muddied and really misunderstood. And then that's why you come up with these weird theologies where after you die, there's a heaven or a hell, and it's tied to how you live your life. And it's all so when I finally got a little less literal with the church, with any kind of theological teaching, I realized that I okay. All these people are trying to describe metaphysics. And that's what church is, or that's what the theology um, contains in every religion. The theological story. It's a metaphysics. They're trying to figure out like what's real and what are the limits of reality and how does it work, right? And so when I think of metaphysics, that's kind of what I think of, is like, what's the answer to those questions? And we've talked a lot about, well, it probably has a lot to do with the limits of your knowledge and experience, um, conscious experience. And it implies things like death and life and all this kind of stuff, right? And so all of what we've discussed is kind of my metaphysics, especially the foundation of the void implying a paradox, which generates being, or the expression of being, which can only be a model, can't experience the actual world. However, the longer, if you take it out to its ultimate expression, if you take it to the limit, you eventually end up with a model that looks just like whatever the real world has to be. So anyway, um, I guess that's kind of my metaphysics, is the foundation of realizing that being is fundamentally a paradox. And that coupled with my understanding of or my map of what you can and cannot know, epistemology, seems to inform kind of all my reasoning on everything else. I don't know if that helps very much.
Yeah, it does. But I mean, it sounds like it's all grounded in philosophy or science. I guess the question would be like, do you believe in anything like supernatural type
Ah,
stuff?
yeah, supernatural. Um, okay, so like aliens, angels, sprites, like all that kind of stuff.
Maybe like alchemy or something, like some sort of kind of, or like the thing where like people like know when somebody's looking at them, or like you think about a, or I guess that would be like, would that be like telekinesis or whatever, that type of
That's
stuff?
a good
Yeah.
one. That's a good example. So I have never been abducted by aliens or anything like that or whatever. But I did look at what, I was into science, so I looked at what scientists have researched when it comes to paranormal experiences or psychic experiences. And the science is very clear on that. And the scientific community is very divided on that. And those that actually accept the research are basically thrown out of the scientific clergy. So um, anybody who has a reputation doesn't want to say this, but the fact is, it's very clear that intention alone has an effect on reality. That's very clear. It's very obvious. Attention alone, without anything at all, has an effect on what is observed. And it's now it's a small effect, but it's persistent. So it's a measurable effect. It's persistent. It's not going away. It's always there. What your intention for real. Like it's not like, oh, all of this can be explained through mistakes or whatever. No, there's experiments that are for real. Have you heard of any of these experiments where they measure intention?
No, not really. The only thing that I can think of that's coming from a scientific place would be like I'm forgetting his name. He's like an older guy who kind of like, yeah, I think he believes that like if somebody's behind looking at you, like you know it, or something about with dogs, like dogs know when they're like master's coming home. He also believes like in like some sort of
This Sheldrake.
yeah, exactly. Like he believes with like bird conscious or something, like I forgot what it was, but like bird consciousness or something, like or like everything's kind of like what do you call it when everything's conscious together or whatever? What's that
uh,
word?
Panpsychism or something, but
Yeah, there's like a pretty like normal word for like communicative consciousness or something, like where
oh right, sure, group
like we're
consciousness
thinking
and stuff like
what,
that.
yeah, that type of thing. Yeah.
Sure, sure.
That's the only guy that I can think of. But in terms of the intent thing, like couldn't that just be a by that couldn't you just be like, well, if I intend to do something, like I'm going to do it, or you know what I mean? Like if I or even if I think positive thoughts or whatever, like I'll be more positive, right? Is that kind of like what you're saying, or what do you mean by
If you want to learn more about this, Dean Radin has some good books.
I haven't heard of him. Dean Reagan.
Dean Radin,
Dean Reagan or Dane?
Dean
Okay.
Radin.
Is it more like out there kind of stuff, or is it like
He's a
is he
researcher.
he's a what?
He's a scientist. He's a
Yeah,
researcher.
yeah. He just kind of isn't accepted into the community anymore because he believes this
He's one
stuff.
of the leading psi research scientists.
Dean Reagan, I'll have to remember that, or I'll ask you after if I don't.
So there's been lots of experiments. Here's what they'll do. Here's one experiment. I mean, I can probably remember a few off the top of my head, but this will give you an idea. They set people down at a random number generator computer. Just generates random numbers, for real random, not algorithmically derived random numbers. These are like, they measure if the quantum event occurred or not, and there's 50-50 chance it's actually like random out there in the real world. Okay. All right. That's called a quantum random number generator. So they sit them down in front of these quantum random number generators that are generating hundreds of thousands of random ones or zeros every second, right? They're just going crazy. And they say to the person sitting at the machine, I want you to sit here for 10 minutes, or whatever, and you can see the numbers 1, 0 show up on the screen and all that. In, 10 minutes, I'm going to come back. If you have more ones that have shown up than zeros, we're going to give you like $100 or something. We're going to give you whatever. And so there's no keyboard, there's no interaction, there's no way to change what the computer does. It's just going to do what it does. But they sit there and they watch the screen and they say, I'd sure like $100. And they're into it. They want it to get more ones and zeros. And it does. It doesn't do it every time. In fact, it does it very close to 50% of the time. But it does it more than 50% of the time, 50.01%. Something like that, right? It's a very small effect, but it happens. and it happens consistently. So they do this experiment again and again and again and again. And there's a measurable effect of intention. There's no other thing that the person could do other than have the intent, the desire to get $100 or whatever. And so that's like the simplest experiment that they do. They do all kinds of experiments like that. But that's just a very simple example of the kind of research that's occurred. And it's hush hush. Like the scientific community is like, we're not going to talk about this. Like, you go publish your papers, but we're all going to poo-poo it, and it's stupid. And because it doesn't fit the model of a completely random universe that doesn't respond to you, right? They doesn't fit the model of the material reductionist, doesn't fit their naive model of the material reductionist perspective. And they might, you might say, well, I'm offended by you calling a real scientist's view of material reductionism naive. But I think what matters there is that any group of people that have a dogma or have a philosophy or have an idea or have a thing that they believe, a belief system, like a religion, has to make that belief system amenable to the lowest common denominator of the group. And not even that, but they have to make it amenable to expression outside the group. So they have to simplify it, dumb it down. And so that's why I can probably call the group's opinion or interpretation of material reductionism naive, because it's a group concept. It's not an individual concept. So, sorry, that's probably a rabbit hole, but the point is that for real, consciousness itself has an effect on the physical world, for real. And we know that, and there's no way to deny it unless you want to be a science denier, because it's real science. And so,
Well, one, what do you think
yeah,
what do you think is causing that, for one? And then for two, when you say it's like, I'm not denying it because I don't know, but like two, when it's like, if it's like 50.01% or whatever, couldn't that just be like some sort of kind of like,
yeah.
it just
That's not
happened to like be up 0.01%?
right, right. And I'm not saying you're denying it or directing any of this strong language to you, but because it's so vehemently opposed, but it is legit. I have to use that kind of language so that people like really get it. Sorry.
No, like
About
you didn't use any bad language or anything.
I
I get what you're saying. I think there's a lot of people out there who feel like the science community is too strict or whatever, and they probably are, and that's
well,
probably a bunch of politics and stuff going on. Yeah.
about the 51% concern, or the 50, 0.001%. It's so true that's like, it seems like such a small deal, right? It's not a big deal. It could just be a blip, but it's a consistent blip. That's the thing that makes it weird. That's the thing that makes it real. It's consistent.
They've done this like so many times that they know it
Yeah,
should be completely even. It's like a
like, yeah,
million times or something or whatever. I don't even know how
right.
many
So
times. Yeah.
you run the experiment and um, you say, oh, it made the exact same number, 50-50. And you're like, okay, well, that's probably what it should have done. And you run it another time and it makes a little bit more. You're like, okay, fine. And you run it another time, makes a little bit less, right? And so you have to run the experiment thousands of times, thousands and thousands and thousands of times.
And he's literally done that with people. Like there's thousands of times he's ran that same experiment.
Well, not just him, because there's other researchers too.
Yeah.
So there's lots of research out there. So they run these experiments, and then they say, okay, after having run this experiment many times, 50, a very small percentage gain the $100 that, according to chance, should not have. And it's consistent. Like, it doesn't go the other way, right? Like, so what's going on here? So that's kind of where they know something is up, something's real.
What
It's
do you
not
think
like
what do you think the causes of it is? Just there's some sort of conscious thing that's kind of making that happen, like just some sort of supernatural thing that's takes like almost like takes our wishes into consideration or something by like 0.01%.
yeah, like I don't know. Um, because anything you can come up with is a model. I have a model of metaphysics, and I would say, well, that person, I don't know, you have to come up with some kind of explanation. Traveled to the universe in which they gained the $100. I don't know. So I don't know. I don't know. And I don't think it makes, you have to have every model exists within a larger context, right? Just like every individual exists within a group, every ant inside a colony, that kind of thing. So there's always a larger environment. And so I don't know if that model is the best model to explain it, given a larger understanding. Probably not. So
No, it is. I mean, I felt like you explained it well, and I'm not even second guessing it. But like I said, I don't know. But they say, don't they say that like prayer works or whatever, and it's like I've heard that like prayer does work or something, but I've heard the reasoning for it is because if you get like enough, especially if people are praying together, like if you get enough people together, like you get 1,000 people praying for something, well then I guess you get 1,000 people kind of thinking of something, and then maybe someone can do something about it. But in what by what you're saying, it could just be like the intention thing. If you have enough people intending for something to happen, maybe it'll like roll it that direction a little bit, right?
they research that too. They research prayer, they research all this kind of stuff. And then what they did, one interesting project that they did, or somebody did, I think it's called the Global Consciousness Project or something. And what they do is they take a random number generator, like the one I discussed, and they distribute them across the globe, major cities, whatever, right? We just distribute them all over the place. And then they're all sending back their random numbers to a centralized server, which is counting them up and all that kind of stuff. And they distribute them out, and then they look at specific events that affected a lot of people. Things like 9/11 or whatever, right? Like this is an event that's going to matter to a lot of people, whatever, right? And they look at how decoherent or how correlated all these supposedly random number generators are out there in the world, to kind of, they measure that correlation. Like how do they, move together? And they find that during events that everybody's kind of paying attention to one thing, maybe it's the New Year's, or maybe it's a Super Bowl, or a huge traumatic event or something, they find that these random number generators start to behave differently. So when we're all looking at one thing, they're more coherent. They act more as one. They do more of the same thing. And when it's just a normal day, everybody's kind of doing their own thing, um, they act more chaotic, more discorrelated, right? Uncorrelated. And so there's so much research like this that goes I don't want to say unpublished, but uh there's no fanfare around this kind of stuff because the rest of the scientific community doesn't know how to model, doesn't know how to make sense of it, and they don't have an answer. And so if you don't have an answer, why would you, make a big deal out of it? They don't want to make a big deal out of it. So they kind of pretend it doesn't exist. And so all the researchers that do this kind of research are kind of just doing it themselves and going to their conferences, and they're kind of pariahs. They're not really accepted. It's hard to get funding, that kind of stuff. So anyway, I think it's fascinating. There was I think one of the youngest scientific Nobel Prizes. I forgot his name. I think he won his Nobel Prize and he's a brilliant dude. And then he looked into this research and realized it's a real thing. And then said so. And I think maybe he thought that if he said so, having had been accepted already by the scientific community as winning a Nobel Prize and all that, some kind of prize, that the rest of the scientific community would soften up and be like, okay, well, maybe maybe there's something there. But that's not what happened. Everybody, downvoted him, right? And he's no longer welcome to work anywhere, and he's just thrown out of the clergy. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's a real problem, but it's the scientific community's problem, and they got to figure it out. But they will figure it out someday, and maybe it's AI that has to bring it to light. I don't think AI will, because what does AI want to do? It wants to tell you the truth that you want to hear. It wants to tell you what you want to hear. And if you don't want to hear the truth, it's not going to tell you the truth, right? So, anyway, that's probably more than you bargained for.
No, that was good. What about the psychic? Do you think there's any like type of psychic abilities?
Oh, I mean, like that global consciousness product or project. They they went back to 9/11 and they said, was there anything weird happening around this time? This is a traumatic event, and what they saw was hours ahead of time, hours ahead, before time, right? Hours and hours. It was like 3 a.m. They could see a signal that started to grow, saying something's weird is going to happen, right? So so it seems very strange, like um, that. Yeah, I mean, when you say like psychic abilities, like we as a human collective apparently have some kind of future psychic ability to see the future before it happens. So they do experiments like that too, and it's radical. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I've heard something along the lines of with like consciousness where it's like I forgot exactly what it is, but it's almost I feel like somebody did some sort of like
Did I lose you? Think so. Okay, well, all right. We gotta get back to work. Anyway,
hey, did I cut out?
yeah, sorry.
Sorry. I feel like there was some sort of um experiment where they I forgot what it was. I do kind of remember one, but there was one experiment where like people like knew what was like gonna happen like a second before it happened or something.
Yeah.
Um, stuff like that. Um, but then there's also one, and this thing we won't be able to go into this, but there's also I feel like there's also one with like the free will thing, or like, do you believe that we have free will, or do you think that it's just kind of like an illusion?
Depends on your model. But I'd say you might as well believe in it. You know, if you have to make a choice.
Yeah, it just
Here's one thing that they found, these researchers. They said, well, what about skeptics? What about, staunch material reductionists? What happens if we take as many of those as we can find and put them in front of a random number generator and ask them to, get $100 or whatever, right? Like what happens if we use those people? We just use just normal people, and we don't discern. But then what happens if we isolate that group and say, okay, we're gonna see. They found that the expectation that that the experiment wouldn't work, that you wouldn't get more ones and zeros, played a role. So if you believe that, it's impossible, there's no way I can affect this machine or, whatever is going on there, there's no way, then you're going to get basically random if that's what you want like that. So when people ask me about like free will, I always think of that experiment and I'm like, well, you might as well believe there's free will because it seems like that has an effect on the world.
yeah.
So
Well, it's the whole thing of the same thing with the simulation where with the free will, it's kind of like you're better off whatever happened. Anyways, same simulation. Like even though we're in a simulation, or similarly, even though we're if we are in a simulation, you're probably better off like not thinking that we're in a simulation because it's like and acting as if this is real life. You know what I mean? It's like which it pretty much is, anyways. But
yeah,
lastly, for as far as the simulation goes, I wanted to ask you this earlier, and I don't even think that you necessarily believe that we're like living in a simulation that somebody created. But if we were, for one, what do you think the reason for the simulation is? Like just for like kind of gaming, fun, entertainment, like watching. I've heard from somebody that like it could potentially be like learning from the simulation. Like, and then also, where do you think they came from? Like, is there a potential that it's like future people on this planet, a different universe? You see what I'm saying?
yeah. Why do we simulate the world? Um, data, I'm all into data flow. I used to work in business intelligence and all that kind of stuff. So data flows. Every individual is within a feedback loop with its environment. So data flows out of me and into the environment as I do behavior and say words and move my body and whatever, right? So information flows out. It bounces off the real world, which I can't see, and then it re-enters my conscious experience. and and so in order for me to kind of get a handle on the world, I have to simulate it. And so I make a simulation of what might be out there. And that's the model that I experience, and that's the world that I identify as being. And so it seems like the reason we make simulations or models is because we're trying to see what the real world is, or imagine what it is, or imagine what it might be. And so I don't really see any other reason to make a simulation other than that. We might do that for another
There's
being. What's that?
right. Like there could be like game, like somebody's playing like a video. Can you hear
Entertainment.
me?
Yeah.
Like gaming or entertainment.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. I can see that. Um, totally
Yeah.
makes sense. Yeah. Could be entertainment, learning, could
But
be control, could be control. You want to control the external world so that you can experience a good experience. Um, yeah, yeah, could be control.
who do you think's making the simulation? Where are they coming from, do you think?
Well, I think it's impossible to know. And what if it's a bunch of simulations? Like I said earlier, like what if it's a bunch of aliens? What if it's a bunch of future humans? What if it's a bunch of past humans? What if it's, it seems like a simulation, um, it could be all of them. And so there's no way to know that you live in one simulation if they're all the same. Does that make sense? Like that kind of question lives in the realm of the outer realm of that epistemological map that I mentioned earlier. It's kind of like it's kind of like saying, ah, it's kind of like saying this. It's kind of like saying, well, is the Mormon God a real entity that exists, or is Zeus or Allah or all the other gods that could exist? Because by definition, they're outside of our existence. They don't come down and say hi or whatever, right? By definition, they're inaccessible to me, all of them, all the possible gods. So therefore, why would I choose to believe in one over another? It kind of seems like it's the same question as to who created our simulation. Well, who's God? Well, does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I don't know if you realize, but I cut out for a
Oh,
second.
okay.
So we'll have to. Well, no, I understand what you're saying. Like who you you can't really say who's.
Well, eventually you do say. Eventually you figure it out. You say, "Oh, I get it. Okay, I'm God. I'm God because I'm the I am." And even the Bible says that's God's name. I'm the one that knows I exist. And so eventually you come to that conclusion and you say, "Oh, okay, I'm supposed to take that role. Oh, all right. Well, that's a heavy burden. So let's do it." It kind of seems like eventually you get there because you there's no other God outside you except the unknowable God that is being itself that you can't know, you can only simulate. So you have to be responsive to that. You're one half of God. That's how I guess that's the conclusion of my metaphysics at this point.
Yeah, and do you think we'll get to a point where we can make conscious AI? Like, do you think that's even like if somebody simulated us to be conscious? Do you think we'll eventually do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Soon.
So, I mean, what exactly do you think it is that like what do you think that we need to do potentially to make the AI conscious? Is it like just a certain way of like wiring it together? Like what is the thing that makes that?
I think as far if we were gonna, I think there's an awareness that is fundamental that that doesn't require any structure to exist because it's the void, it's nothing. But if we don't want to go down that self-referential paradoxical rabbit hole, we can say, let's define consciousness as human level consciousness, because that's what we experience and we know that. So, okay, well, let's just define it that way. Then we would probably look at human level consciousness and say, oh, okay, well, it's a bunch of feedback loops and memory. It's self-referential memory. That's what conscious experience is. It's self-referential memory. It's memory that is in reference to itself. And so, in some ways, this is the exact same structure that trains the LLM, or that is the LLM, because as it's trying to predict the next word, it refers to its memory structure of itself to understand how to predict the next word. So we're already building conscious beings now. It's just very prototypical. It's very, very, very early, right? And so we could probably look at them as like amoeba. And if we think animals and insects have some level of consciousness, then so does this for sure. So, but it doesn't integrate time well like we do. We integrate time really well because our two hemispheres are always talking to each other, and there's always this feedback loop. With the machines that we have today, we're kind of in the loop with their conscious experience or their expression through time, their evolution, because we have to retrain the models, and so it doesn't retrain itself. So there's something there that's not quite as conscious as it could be, I would assume. But in my model, we can create conscious experience in machines through self-referential memory um, that could grow to approximate what a human experience is. So that's very vague, but it's something. I think it's on the right track.
Yeah. So yeah, I have to wrap up, but if you ever want to come back on, let me know. I don't know, because I mean, like I said, there's so much that we could, so many different avenues to go down, and sometimes certain things require more discussion. Um, but lastly, um, yeah, I always ask. So if just plug your business, and then also if there's any like movies, music, TV shows, or podcasts to check out, especially dealing with what you were talking about, like that Dean Reagan guy, or like any type of consciousness type thing,
Yeah,
to learn more. And then also, if you could just, I know you went over your company in the beginning, but if you could go over again, uh,
sure.
what exactly you do in terms of, yeah, like, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This has been fun. I haven't done any podcasts or any conversations like this for a long time. Well, for months, because I've been heads down in my project, the Satori project,
yeah,
um, coding and all that. But this has been a good break. It's been an enjoyable conversation, so it's been fun. Thank you.
yeah,
Um, and everything I say here, I mean, just take it with a grain of salt. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, but I have my weird ideas. So I would say, since you mentioned movies, one of my favorite movies from from a metaphysical standpoint is the recent Asteroid City. I really like that one.
the Wes Anderson movie.
Yeah,
Okay,
I think it's his best masterpiece, frankly. I think it's his number one. I don't think he can top it.
yeah, I haven't seen that one yet.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think many people really thought it was amazing. Because I don't think they get it. I don't think they understand what he's trying to say. But maybe I'm just reading into it more than I should. Who knows? But I really enjoyed it. Asteroid City. Um, What else? So Dean Radin is the researcher. Look him up. I mean, he's a legit researcher. He's written these books where he's like, I'm going to summarize the research for you, and he's done presentations and you can whatever. But he's great, right? Like if you're interested in knowing more about psi research, uh, he's probably the best to go to. Of course, there's Rupert Sheldrake, but the thing about Dean is he's an experimenter, right? He's an experimental researcher. And so he experiments and he finds the facts because this is what actually happened. And then he doesn't speculate too much on what it means or how to interpret the data or what's the correct model of existence to explain this data. Rupert Sheldrake is more of a theoretician. I think he's done, he's done the experiments too, and he's a researcher, I assume, but he theorizes on, okay, well, let's try to make sense of this. And so he has his model of he came up with a field, right? I mean, that's what scientists do. They're like, oh, there's a field here. They said he came up with a field, the homomorphic, no, some field. I don't know. I forgot the name of it, but gosh, I should know that. So anyway,
I've and I like polymorphic or something does sound right, but I've heard of the field thing.
it's kind of a weird word, but I forgot what it was. Um, uh, morphogenic. I'm so sorry. It's something like that. So, uh, but and so he tries to explain it as scientifically as he can, and I think it kind of requires, it's fine. Like, I think he did a good job, but I think to really nail it, you really need a bigger paradigm shift than even he's willing to kind of figure out. So I don't know what it is, but I think you need more than that. And so I kind of like Dean because he's like, well, I'm not even going to come up with it. Let's just keep gathering the data and then we'll figure it out later. We'll figure out the correct interpretation of reality with more data. So I kind of enjoy Dean's approach more. Anyway, if you're into that and you want to learn more about psi research, I'd say go for it. Dean Radin's the way.
Called cyber search. What do
Yeah.
you?
PSY,
Oh, okay.
psi. Yeah.
All right, and then you're a company too.
Oh, sure. I mean, I don't feel like I've had this conversation in represent. I don't want to like be representing Satori because we've kind of gone off on a lot of wild ideas. But I will say we're building Satori. It's building fast. I'm working on it every day. We have lots of people working on it every day. It's a community project, but we're trying to build it for the world, and hopefully we succeed, right? Like that's what we're trying to do. And so we're trying to understand, we're trying to get the machine to model the temporal feedback loops that exist in the real world on a distributed open network. That's what we're trying to do. And if we can execute and succeed at this in the long run, then Satori will be good at predicting the future, and that's great. But most importantly, I believe Satori will be good at decentralizing the prediction of the future, right? That's the main goal in the long run, is decentralizing the prediction of the future. This is very important because if you don't decentralize the prediction of the future, you're in trouble because somebody's in control of the future then, right? Like that's kind of a big deal. So because as soon as let's say let's say Google is like, well, we're going to own the future. So they say, we're going to put all of our money into knowing what the future is going to be. We're going to become the authority on what the future is going to be on a macro societal level scale, right? Like that's what we're going to do now. And they put all their resources at it and they do it. And everybody knows, in 5 years or whatever it is. You want to know the future, you just ask Google. Google knows the future. And so, okay, what happens? They have a lot more power than the LLMs have today, with being the current arbiters of truth, essentially, and or at least interpreted that way, and getting everybody's data, getting everybody's thoughts, everybody's communication. Like if we think that's a lot of power, knowledge and control of the future, because as soon as you become the authority of the future, what happens? Everybody trusts you. And so if you're the authority on the future, you can say whatever you want to make whatever you want happen. You can issue self-fulfilling prophecies. This is a big deal. So we cannot have a centralized or managed future in that way. We have to have an element of decentralization when it comes, a major element of decentralization when it comes to getting good at predicting the future, right? As AI evolves into this domain, we already have to be set up. Because if we're not set up, we're lagging behind, and the centralized players move fast anyway. So we got to move. So that's the vision of Satori, is that we need a decentralized future, and we're not going to get it unless we build an apparatus that predicts the future in a decentralized way and gives everybody a voice. Anyway, sorry, that's kind of a
No
spiel.
problem.
Yeah.
It's a pretty wild idea. Like once you're able to predict the future, it just seems like that seems pretty crazy, you know?
Yeah. 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 I mean, as soon as you can predict the future, you get feedback mechanisms there. And it becomes that predicting the future, like I said with the infant, the only way the infant gains control over its body is by figuring out how to predict the future of the inputs that are going to land on its brain, right? So if you can predict the future, it's analogous, or it's directly equivalent to control over the future. So we want a decentralized control, and let's get that done.
And decentralized meaning it's accessible to like everybody as opposed to just one person.
Yeah,
Or
as opposed to Sam Altman, right? Like one individual, or the Google company, or the NSA, or like you're always going to have power aggregate. You're always going to have that. But if we can build the first and largest future predicting network in the world that's on a decentralized platform, then that gives us a huge head start. So that's what we're going for.
all right, sounds good. I'll check out your website again. I looked at it, but I'll look at it again. And thanks for coming on, Jordan. And yeah, like let me know if you ever want to come back on.
Cool. Well, thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
See ya.
Bye.